Okay. Good morning, and welcome to this Vice Chancellor's Forum on COVID-19, Partnering in the Caribbean's Response. I'm Professor Winston Moore, Deputy Principal at the University of West Indies Cayfield campus, and it's my pleasure to chair this morning's program. Today's Vice Chancellor Forum is aimed at helping the Caribbean to formulate a response to COVID-19 and follows a previous Vice Chancellor's Forum on demystifying the coronavirus. If you missed this very informative session, I would encourage you to visit the UWITV website at uwitv.org and view that discussion. The University of West Indies takes its role as a public university very seriously, and today's discussion is just one of the many lectures, seminars, forums, and the like available on UWITV aimed at enhancing public education on issues of regional importance. As you're aware, a pneumonia virus of unknown cause was detected in Wuhan, China, and reported to the World Health Organization office in China on 31st December 2019. It was later identified as the coronavirus, or COVID-19, on 30th January 2020. The outbreak was declared a public health emergency of international concern, and the international community asked for US $675 million to help protect countries with weaker health systems as part of a strategic preparedness response plan. Preparedness and strategic response plans are a key part of public health emergencies like COVID-19. These policies and programs are aimed at containing the spread of the virus or mitigating its effects once the virus is already widespread. Some of these policies can have large economic and social costs, and it's important that scientific evidence be used as a basis for formulating preparedness plans. For example, the widespread closure of schools, as we have seen in some countries around the world, can lead to parents missing work or making other arrangements for the care of their children. In addition, I've heard of the concept called stay away from men. Hopefully, I can get some discussion of that concept and whether or not I need to leave home and stay away from my wife and my daughter from the experts that we have on the panel this morning. Today, I have with me a group of experts to discuss the economic impact of COVID-19 first, and I'd like to introduce the chair of this session, Dr. Don Marshall.
Thank you very much, Winston, and welcome to all present and online. I may just start by saying that we have an esteemed panel. He's just introduced me, but I'm not part of that esteemed group. I would like to think that those that are coming after me will impress you with their granular analysis and presentations. So first up in this order would be Dr. Justin Ram. He's Director of Economics of the Caribbean Development Bank. His specializations are in energy and development economics. He's previously worked as senior global economist with Worley Parsons, as an economist with the UK's government's Department for Transport, and a supervisory economist with the Greater London Authority. Justin has also been a class teacher at the London School of Economics and Political Science and was lecturer in economics at the UWI St. Augustine campus. He has also worked as a consultant on many oil and gas and energy-related projects in Central Asia, and also Africa and with the World Bank. He's also worked with the United Nations and the International Labour Organization. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and prior to that, an MSc in Economics from the University College of London. Of course, his first degree was in Economics from our University of the West Indies, and he has a postgraduate certificate in Sustainable Environmental Management from the University of California, Berkeley. Online, we have our second speaker in line, would be Dr. Michelle McLeod. She is currently the head of the UWI Center for Hotel and Tourism Management in the Bahamas. Her tourism industry experience, I should say, spans over 28 years, and she's a graduate of the UWI, the University of Surrey and Bournemouth University, where she obtained a doctorate, and she has co-edited 2 books entitled Knowledge Networks and Tourism Management in Warm Water Island Destinations. Her present research interests are in the subject areas of tourism, knowledge networks, open data ecosystems, policy networks, destination networks, and service productivity. She received the Principals Award for the research project with greatest economic impact for the Faculty of Social Sciences in 2018. The Principals Award for Research Project attracting the most research funds in the Faculty of Social Sciences. She also won that 2 years prior in 2016. And in that same year, she won Best Researcher in the Mona School of Business and Management. And she has done some outstanding work. She's a winner of the PhD Consortium Best Presentation Prize going back to 2008. So she's second up. And then we have our own Senator Lisa Cummins. She's the Executive Director of UWI Lumen Consulting. She's a Barbadian national. She's recently appointed Senator to the Barbados Parliament, and she's Chair of the Barbados Port Authority. Senator Cummins is currently the Executive Director of the UE Consulting Group. As I mentioned earlier, it's called Lumen Consulting, and she is an international trade specialist by training. She lived and served in the East African region from 2008 until 2011, where she served as Uganda's lead technical advisor and a member of the negotiating team for services in the East African community, specifically dealing with trade talks with Europe and the EAC, that will be the East African Community Common Market. During that time, Senator Cummins worked on projects in East and Southern Africa for several development partners, including the World Bank, UNTAD, the European Union, and Trademark East Africa in her current role. She leads teams which provide advisory services to Caribbean institutions, including the Planning Institute of Jamaica, the Development Bank of Jamaica, the Caribbean Development Bank, and numerous regional governments. This is our esteemed panel. My name is Don Marshall. I am the director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute, and I have been laboring in the vineyard of UWI for over 20 years. That's about it in relation to my own introduction. Now, may I say to you, audience, that we're at a moment where a number of interacting and converging crises greet this region. Today we're talking about COVID-19. This morning I got a Twitter feed with someone, a young child, addressing the president of South Africa via Twitter, and she said, "Mr. President, hashtag coronavirus is here, and so is a recession. Do something." Now, I thought that was an interesting tweet because of the ways in which people on the ground may feel about not only the fact that the COVID-19 presents a threat, but also it comes at a time where we've just been past the Great Recession, marked by a not so great recovery, and now we are faced with this crisis. The good thing, though, is that the WHO has not announced this as a pandemic. So when we say do not panic, those words are really to be taken seriously. We should not panic. We should act responsibly. We should act intelligently. The UWA has a responsibility to think responsible, in a responsible manner. And this presentation today is an attempt to provide some rigorous analysis while also taking note of the economic, this morning first, the economic impact before we get to the medical and the other expert opinions on the subject. May I say that immediately, we all know that as tourism-dependent islands, we face an uncertain future in relation to the COVID-19 and what is required in relation to protocols for travel. And the view is that already we are seeing many airlines hit by absence of passengers, and the willingness to travel has slowed somewhat. Maybe there may be an uptick to that once countries around the world have settled on the protocols, once the medical surveillance protocols and the public messages around washing your hands and doing the necessary things start to kick in as a normal, routinized thing. Maybe we may see a return to confidence in the travel industry. But we in the region face that immediate threat, and we also face the prospect that if this were to become a pandemic as labeled by the WHO, then we have to start thinking in different ways, because the risk metrics associated with, say, our insurance, the risk metrics associated with everything we do with business will have to be reviewed. Certainly insurance companies, when they're looking at risks, they look at the geographical sensitivities in relation to risk. So already in their calibrations, because we are hurricane-based region, risk is calculated according to that kind of prospect. If you add now the coronavirus, and it's a pandemic, then the question of risk for reinsurance companies would be a matter of high concern. So that's an international business issue, and we will be very sensitive to that. And I'm sure Justin and others would elaborate on this. One other aspect I want to turn to before turn over to the panel, and this relates now to the industrial relations climate in this current moment. No doubt, as the surveillance protocols continue to be rolled out, employers will be faced with a new way, certain new recommendations for handling medical advice in relation to workers staying home with their relatives, or workers who have been exposed by someone who's at home with the COVID-19. Days lost from work would be a new normal as we adjust, and the employers have to adjust accordingly. Also, persons working in areas where there is no job security, the moral obligation for them to self-report that they're ill is going to spike. And there's no telling how they will respond. So we're going to see some particular changes and reactions in our labor markets in ways that we cannot anticipate or research for what would be the intended, what would actually unfold. So there's a way in which, when thinking about the COVID-19 and the economic impact, there are some unforeseens. There are some things that we cannot necessarily guess at, but what we as a research team, what we as workers in different parts of the region would do is to continue to keep a pace with best practices and advise on the best procedures possible. I want to turn now directly to Dr. Ram. He has a PowerPoint presentation. After him, we would turn to Dr. Michelle McLeod. So a hand for Justin Ram.
Okay, pleasant good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Chair, members of the head table, ladies and gentlemen, and those of you online. First of all, I would like to thank the University of the West Indies for inviting the Caribbean Development Bank to be here with you this morning to discuss what, of course, is a very important topic for us. So when I got the invitation, I thought it would be very useful if I put together a few slides to help you sort of understand the economic possibilities associated with the coronavirus. But just as Don was saying in his introduction, if I just go to the outline of the presentation, I really have to give you a reminder of where we are in the Caribbean. And I'll just spend a few minutes on that, because I think that context is important, just as you were saying, Don. Because as we contemplate what our response would be if the coronavirus was to take a huge hit on our economies, we have to understand where we are currently, and so what could be our limitations. I will then speak a little bit about the global impact, what we've been seeing a lot in the news recently. In fact, only this morning I was trying to update the slides with what I was seeing coming across Bloomberg, so we could discuss that as well. I'll speak about what are some of the possible economic impacts in the Caribbean, because at the CDB, I've asked my staff just to run some simulations on our economies, so I'll give you a sense as to what is likely to happen. We've done it for one country thus far, and I'll show you what that is, and then I'll speak about the policy response. So first up, some of the development challenges. Just don't forget that we're already in a tough place, huh? This is my famous ground zero slide now, where I've showed that our GDP growth in the region has dipped below the global average recently, and if this trajectory continues, we're likely to be in a really terrible place by 2050 or thereabouts. So we're already in a tough place. And of course, added to that, we have these other development challenges with respect to our high levels of debt. Of course, some of our countries have made significant progress on this over the last couple of years and certainly over the last decade, but I think we still have a long ways to go, because don't forget that our research has shown that once you get past 60% debt to GDP, then that puts significant stress on your economy as investors begin to become a little bit restless. They want to know what's the likely policy options in the future, and so they begin to hold back on their investment momentum. In addition to that, we have overall high levels of unemployment in some of our countries, as you can see there, as high as 20%. But really, it's that statistic on the right, as it relates to the very young in our societies, who have very high levels of unemployment. And we know at the CDB that in some of our broad member countries, youth unemployment is as high as, well, over 40%. And that, of course, is quite a huge negative, because once you stay out of the labor market for too long, then the possibility of you ever entering the labor market becomes slimmer and slimmer. And of course, I think it's really important as we look out, we have a demographic time bomb on our hands. Huh? If we look out to population projections out to 2100, many of our countries are likely to see significant declines in population. And so the reason why I'm showing you some of these trends right now is that on top of this, we're likely to be dealing with quite a major crisis if it is not contained quickly. And of course, in relation to that, on the left-hand side, I've also showed that our fertility rates are below where they need to be as it relates to replacement values. Remember, we need to be at 2.1 or so to maintain current levels of population. And for some of our countries, we are well below that. So what has been the economic impact so far at the global level of COVID-19? Well, this morning, I think really with what has happened with respect to the oil price is sending shivers through the market. Now, the reason for this, I think the markets are reacting because now what's happened to the oil price is not necessarily only about market fundamentals, but because it's now become political. As we know, there is a standoff between some of the major oil producers in our countries. And so what has happened now is that the oil price is actually back to where it was before OPEC Plus was created a few years ago. And OPEC Plus, of course, is when OPEC was there and Russia became part of that grouping. And now there seems to be some fractures with respect to that grouping. And so they can't seem to align as to what the policy response should be. And so oil prices are plummeting significantly. And of course, related to that, many countries and some of the more developed countries have tried to respond, particularly through monetary policy. But I need to say to you that because of the nature of this crisis, monetary policy is going to have limited impacts, because you can reduce my interest rates by 0.5%, but if I have to stay at home, that's not going to encourage me to go home. And that's not going to bring back the supply chains that could be fractured at this point in time. So I really, later on, I will say to you that there needs to be a fiscal response when it comes to dealing with this particular crisis. And so, of course, although we've seen some responses from the monetary authorities across the globe, stock markets still have not shaken that off. And of course, we can see that as well this morning with what has been happening. Significant declines in stock prices. And I've just showed a bit of a snapshot here. And so, of course, I was looking at the futures markets this morning, and this is, of course, the Monday blues. And right on a Monday, stocks have plunged, yields have created amidst this oil price crash. And that is simply because with the prices of oil crashing, people are trying to look for safe havens to invest their money. And normally, U.S. Treasuries is the safest place to go. But that means that the price of Treasuries and government securities in the U.S. are likely to rise. And as you would know, there's an inverse relationship between the price of securities and the yield. And so the yields are actually at the lowest levels now than they have ever been before, because there's such a huge demand for those securities. So here is it, COVID-19, the shock is unusual as it affects both supply and demand. So we're likely to see this real impact on productivity, this means that the active labor force is likely to go into decline in some of our countries across the globe because many people have to stay at home. And so we're going to have this lost productivity. And so there's likely to be this fall in demand. And so the policy response that I think would be necessary would be one that would shore up demand, and that will have to come on the fiscal side. And like I mentioned before, these are just some of the topics that I spoke about. Investors are looking for safe haven, such as the U.S. assets, and that's affecting bond prices and yields. And so remember, if you are an investor and you're searching for safe haven assets that are U.S. dollar denominated, that can also have a knock-on effect on the exchange rate of the U.S. dollar. So if you're demanding more U.S. dollars, you could possibly see an increase in the value of the U.S. dollars. And for us here in the Caribbean, with many of our currencies tied to the U.S. dollar, if the value of the U.S. dollar is rising, then perhaps our exports, and of course we export tourism, we export commodities, for example, the value of those exports, and so the amount that we're likely to get, could possibly be affected negatively. And of course the stock markets as well if those are plunging, then they're likely to have negative wealth effects as it relates to the stock markets, and people feel as if they don't have as much wealth in their pockets. So what's going to be critical here for us to understand the totality of the fallout? Containment, containment, containment. I think the policy response that we have already seen in some of the countries, so for example, we saw in the northern regions of Italy, where 16 million people have been told that they need to be quarantined until early April, is going to be critical, because if we are going to reduce the fallout from this crisis, containment is going to be critical. And secondly, I think that government, and certainly fiscal policy and regulatory response, will be critical at this point in time. So what are some of the possible economic impacts for us here in the Caribbean? Well, I think it's quite easy for us to think about it here, because we have so many tourism-dependent economies in the Caribbean, which employ roughly about 2.4 million people and contribute significantly to our Caribbean GDP, that if there is any impact on the global travel industry, as of course we've already seen, and of course as the chair has already said, that's going to have a significant impact on us here. The impacts are also going to be felt across the tourism industry, also included in the cruise ship industry. And then finally, for some of our commodity-producing countries, like, for example, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana is now an oil producer, and Suriname, with the prices of oil plunging, they are likely to see a significant hit to their economies. Because as you could imagine, when Exxon was searching for oil and they began producing oil towards the end of last year, the price was pretty high and was going to allow them to recover the cost on every barrel of oil. From what I understand now, where the current prices are, they are likely to experience losses. And if they are experiencing losses, they're unable to pay revenues to the Guyanese government. And that's going to be true throughout all of the oil-producing countries of the region. And so I just thought I'd put this slide up to show you the multiplier effects of tourism, that if we have a hit on tourism, it's not only the tourism industry that's likely to be impacted. There are also these indirect impacts. So, for example, as you know, in some of our countries, the agriculture sector provides significant inputs to the tourism industry. And if tourism is impacted, there's a reduced demand, there's going to be knock-on reduced demand for agricultural products. Knock-on reduced demand for the services provided by taxi drivers, for example. And so this is a multiplier effect when things are good. Think about it, if our rivals come down, then the reverse happens here. And at the end of the slide where we have improved well-being, there's likely to be a decrease in well-being because of the knock-on effects from a reduction in tourism. Yes? So I think it's also necessary for you to understand that in many of the countries that have already been impacted by COVID-19, CARICOM actually imports quite a lot from those countries. And so I thought it would be useful for you to see what are some of the imports that we are actually taking in from those countries, and to think about if supply chains were to be severed from those countries, what could be the likely impacts. So as you can see here, we import quite a lot from the US. If COVID-19 was to have a greater impact in the United States of America, our supply chains are likely to be impacted. Remember, for example, here in Barbados on a weekly basis, and I guess, Lisa, you can back me up here, there are significant imports of food, for example, from the US. Think about what could happen if we can't import our food from the United States. What happens then? Do we have the contingencies in place to allow us to get our food from other source markets? And how quickly can those contingencies be put in place? And so you can see what's happening there. And so if we think about this, here is where we get most of our food and live animals from. On the left-hand side, as you can see, the majority is coming again from the US, and again some from all others, but also from the European Union, China, and Canada. And then, of course, it's not only about the food supply chain, it's also about manufacturing as it relates to machinery and equipment imports by source country as well. So I want you to think about the possible impacts there because of where our supply chains are linked to. And if there are negative impacts in those countries, then we're likely to have quite negative impacts here, indirect impacts on our own economies, beyond even the tourism industry. So I thought it would be useful for us to run some simulations on our economies to see what could be the likely impacts. So we have looked at a service-oriented Caribbean economy. So this is actually a real country. I'm not going to say the name right now because I don't want to put panic into the markets. But we have our models for all of our board member countries in the Caribbean. And so what we've done here, we've assumed that there's going to be a 10% reduction in tourism receipts, not necessarily tourism arrivals, because the tourism receipts is what's really important for economic modeling. And we've also extended a similar type of reduction for related industries: wholesale, retail, and transportation. In fact, these three sectors alone make up about 50% of this nation's GDP. And what have we found? In the baseline scenario, GDP growth for 2020, we were projecting about 3%. That's actually now going to be negative. In addition to that, the primary balance, that is to say, the monies that the government is spending against what it is earning and less interest payments, for example, while that was going to be positive in excess of 3% of GDP, that's probably now going to be down to about maybe just above 2%. But the overall balance of government accounts, while it was always going to be negative, is going to be much more significantly impacted, as you can see from this chart here. And public debt is likely to rise by about almost 4% or so. Yes? Now, some of the assumptions here that we've done in the simulation exercise is to assume that, of course, because there's going to be a reduction in economic activity, the amount of revenues that the government is likely to take on will be less. But we've made the assumption that there will need to be some fiscal stimulus, and so government will have to maintain its level of expenditure. And so here we're going to see these knock-on effects. And this is just for 1 year. Remember that this can happen beyond a year. So very simply, there are going to be significant costs for us, and we'd have to be very mindful of this. So this is just a summary of some of the simulations that we've done on this particular economy. Now, what should be the policy response? I think really the policy response needs to be demand side. We have to think about how we support the economy at this time. And so I've put together some responses that I think we need to be cognizant of. We have to think about how we support labor markets, but also how we support the private sector. Governments, of course, should sufficiently think about resourcing our hospitals and primary care facilities at this point in time with the right amount of labor and financial resources. I think that this is also critical because if, for example, individuals don't have health insurance or that the public health system is insufficient, then we have to think about some way of providing health insurance at this point in time to pay for medical bills associated with the virus. Government should also be encouraged to support and guarantee sick paid leave, because if you have guaranteed sick pay leave, then it's going to be easy for you to self-quarantine. And I think that that's going to be critical at this point in time. So if you don't have that in your place of employment, then the government would need to step in and ensure that that happens. And why that is also important is that it can also be a fiscal stabilizer as well, an automatic stabilizer in the economy, because we don't want a situation where we're saying to people, stay at home, and you have no income. That's no good for anyone. Okay? Firms are also likely to suffer liquidity crunches because of falling demand, and government should be encouraged to provide temporary tax and wage relief as automatic stabilizers. Because if you are having to face a falling demand and your cash flows are being restricted, then it's really difficult to say to those firms that they still have to pay taxes and, of course, provide some wage relief. We might also, and I think this second policy response here is that financial intermediaries might need to become part of this act in the fiscal response, because we need to ask for forbearance to borrowers at this point in time, because it doesn't make sense for a financial intermediary to be hounding down a lender when this, of course, they can't pay. You really have to think about the long term. And so at this point in time, if things become quite critical, we might want to ask financial intermediaries for some forbearance, as it were, to give them some waivers at this point in time, saying that, of course, the monies will be paid later on. There could be an NPV hit there, but I think it's worth it for longer-term resilience. And finally, I think that this is essential for us at this point in time, because while there are short-term policy responses, I think, again, for us in the region, we constantly speak about building resilience. Digital is key. Again, as you would recall, in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian in Bahamas, we understood that digital was key for their recovery, and in fact, the Bahamian government is now piloting their own digital currency, the sand dollar, so that if there is a disaster, you can still get monies to people quite quickly. They don't have to go to a physical bank location. But I think in this response, having the ability to do medical checkups online is going to be critical. And so our digital infrastructure is going to be very, very important. And because as we have quarantine situations, and we might have to encourage people to still work from home, we can still be productive although we are working from home. So digital connectivity is key. I think finally here, for resilience, it's really critical for our governments to build fiscal buffers. We need to have savings funds. And so if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about where we are with respect to our debt to GDP ratios. The reason why we as economists say we need to have that under control is because we really want our governments to save more, so that in times of crisis, they can call on their savings rather than increasing their debt levels. And so, again, I'm pleading to our policymakers that we need to have fiscal buffers to deal with all types of crises that we might be facing. And this is just a slide that just shows you how perhaps medical, digital can work. And the importance of this here is that we can also start thinking about using artificial intelligence to help us do our diagnoses and prescribing, but also, more importantly, alerting policymakers to possible crisis in our countries, because you are looking at so many data points. You can actually see when a crisis is about to happen and do the necessary things to prevent that from happening. And then my final slide here is that if we are going to do all of this, we have to avoid culture eating our COVID-19 response for breakfast. And so how we implement our response is actually critical, and I always end my presentations with this. There's 8 steps to delivery. I think at this point in time, even at the CARICOM level, and perhaps even at governmental levels, if this becomes a crisis for the Caribbean and we need to have a significant response, we have to understand how we are going to respond to this. And I think having a delivery unit that reports directly to the head of government will be critical. And this is, of course, the 8 steps process to that, which includes having KPI targets and, of course, accountability to our people and to our leaders about the response and how we are doing. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand it back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ram. That was a very comprehensive coverage there that you did, and I'm sure it complements a number of biosecurity plans as well. The interface between biosecurity and the economic security issues that you raise are very clear. I want to turn to our online guest, Dr. Michelle McLeod. She's a panelist and I'm hoping that we can say that she's queued and ready. Dr. McLeod? Okay, at this point, we are awaiting her intervention. So what we can do is, if there is no signal at this point, we can move on to Senator Lisa Cummings. And bear in mind, Dr. McLeod, we will come back to you in about 15 minutes' time. So just stand by again. So we'll come back to you, Dr. McLeod, in about 15 minutes' time. Stand by. Meanwhile, I introduce you to Senator Lisa Cummings.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall.
Press the red button.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marshall. The University of the West Indies, as you said quite rightly, has to very much be in the forefront of providing thoughtful analysis of critical issues facing the Caribbean, and this forum very much, along with our partners, takes us a long way towards doing that. I want to, of course, recognize the importance of bringing those people who are frontline operatives to the table along with us in the university, and so I need to take a moment to recognize that the entire senior leadership of the Barbados Port is here with us this morning to share in the insights being provided by the colleagues that are here today, because we recognize that there is a significant impact. So Dr. Ram, in his presentation, gave a comprehensive overview of where we were as a region prior to COVID-19, the recessionary conditions that we have all been facing, the challenges that all of our economies across the region have been encountering with regard to growth, the issues that we have been dealing with in the labor market and in terms of employment challenges, and he's also spoken about some of our sectoral development challenges as a result of the global environment. And then he's brought us to where we are here now in this moment. And I want to take a moment to start there. And I call this, what I'm going to share, probably more along the lines of the economics of fear. And I call it that simply because we're dealing with a virus that, as Dr. Marshall mentioned, has not been declared by the World Health Organization as a pandemic. But what the World Health Organization Director General has said, and many others have also repeated, is currently now an infodemic, the infodemic of fear, where people are responding based on their fear of getting ill, of dying, of being infected, of interacting on board airlines, affecting the air transportation industry, of taking a cruise, of thereby affecting the cruise industry, and that is fundamentally having an impact on our tourism-dependent economies. How people perceive their levels of exposure and their ability to respond to those levels of exposure has a critical impact on how our economies will or will not function going forward. And I'll give an example. Certainly for us here in Barbados, and I'll use the example of the Barbados Port, we have had two very public cases in the media, and all across the Caribbean it has been the case where we are hearing of cruise vessels that are either denied entry into respective ports of call, and therefore you have the ripple effect of one country or the other being unable to receive a cruise ship, and then the conversation nationally begins about what if. Now, let's talk about that for a moment. In Barbados alone, we estimate for the last 10 years or so, we've had around 790,000 at a minimum 800,000 passengers on a cruise ship on average. This year, we were estimated to reach about 840,000 passengers by the end of the season in April. We're at 853 as at 2 months ago, and we're going to be seeing those numbers evolving over time. So 853,000 passengers on an annual basis in a single port, and you multiply that all across the Caribbean by way of the number of cruise ships alone, and that does not include our air transportation. So when the economics of fear sets in and people stop taking cruises or people stop flying for conferences or for vacations or anything like that, you have an immediate impact on those tourism receipts that Dr. Ram spoke about, and of course on arrivals. Now, when you talk about the ripple effect and the trickle-down effects, certainly to the wider economy, those passengers, whether they're coming on cruises or they're coming on air transportation, they're engaging in local spend. There's FX generation because the tourism sector is the largest FX generating sector in most of our economies. There's also going to be the spend in tours and attractions. Then there are, of course, the hotels and the restaurants that benefit particularly from long-stay visitors who are engaging in transportation. So the ripple effect on the wider economy is immediate and it is significant. And, of course, that then has a run-on effect on the labor markets that Dr. Ram spoke about. How do you sustain your employment levels if the supply is not what you expect it to be and your projections for the year cannot be maintained by a given firm? And when you consider that we have all faced the recessionary conditions of the last few years, many of us are engaged currently in structural adjustment programs. The question is whether or not any of our economies and many of our firms in the private sector are in a position to have that level of buffering that Dr. Ram spoke about. And so when we talk about the fear of this virus, we have to be able to rationalize managing the science, managing the medical science in particular, what actually needs to be done to contain, as Dr. Ram mentioned. What has been put in place? So here in Barbados, and I'll use the example of Barbados, we have a position that has been taken where we follow the science. We follow the medicine. We take a position where our medical practitioners, namely the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, and here in the region in particular, the English-speaking Caribbean, CARFA, they have been developing a protocol that speaks to the question of containment. How do we manage testing? How do we manage quarantine facilities? How do we manage isolation facilities? How do we manage screening and detection so that that containment is our frontline response, first provided based on the provision of accurate maritime health declarations, as is the case with cruise, and we make sure that those things come in at least on 3 different occasions prior to a vessel even arriving here in port, and across the region that is the now standard. But in addition to that, then there is the question of what if. If there is a COVID case, and the question now has evolved away from what if and when, into when. When we have a COVID case, because that is expected. We now started out with China, we went over to Italy, but 79 countries globally have COVID cases. It is inevitable that we're going to be dealing with a case somewhere in the Anglophone Caribbean, right here in Barbados at some point. What are the implications? I'm asking questions at this point. But cruise is visible. We see big cruise ships offshore. We know that we see them in the newspaper. But to date, there has been very little conversation on how the fear of COVID is actually impacting our productive sectors. And Dr. Ram raised it here today. Last week, Chinese manufacturing was down 40%, largely because of the high number of persons in quarantine in China, and their factories were not functioning at optimum capacity. That had an immediate impact on U.S. production because many of their products are made in China, or the inputs for domestic production in the United States are imported from China, and then they are processed, value added, and then they're re-exported. When we talk about importing from the United States, then, we have a direct correlation to that 40% Chinese manufacturing that went down last week. In the United States, there was a fair last week, and the news was reporting it. about some products completely disappearing off the shelves. And some of those products are actually important to our containment. So sanitizers, the masks that are being used by our medical professionals, all of those things in some instances not only are flying off the shelves, but their replacements made in China are being affected by that 40% demand, reduction in demand, in production. What that means is that we have cargo ships that no one sees because they're not as visible as cruise ships that transport those supplies, those imports, those goods, the commodities as well as the manufactured goods. You have a number of local companies here in the region who are dependent on imports as inputs for their own productive processes. And there is that run-on impact as well. So can we allow fear, the economics of fear, to shape our response? And the answer obviously has to be no. So there has to be the following of the science in the first instance. There has to be the sharing of information. There has to be the development of those protocols, as has already happened. And there has to be collaboration. And I'm quite comfortable with the idea that under the leadership of the CARICOM Secretariat, Barbados' Prime Minister is presently chair of CARICOM. Last Sunday, we had a meeting here in Barbados where among all of the CARICOM heads, many of the agencies, I see Sedima, you're here today. Ronald Jackson was also in that meeting 2 Sundays ago. And many of the teams were here for the purpose of assessing these very issues. What will be the process for containment, management of information flow, the introduction of protocols that are applied evenly across the country, but with a clear understanding at the same time that each country in the Caribbean is different. So Jamaica has a different capacity than St. Kitts does. St. Lucia has a different capacity than Tobago may. Barbados has a different capacity, and those things are all dependent on what the country's governments determine is their own local capacity. And those things have to be taken into account because every economy is going to be impacted very differently. And I want to raise the question of the human impact. And I don't think this is something that we've talked about in economic terms, certainly. For us in the port here in Bridgetown, I think we have a bird's eye view as it relates to cruise, particularly, about the human impact. There is something profound, I think that's the best way of describing it, about seeing a cruise ship out to sea. And many of us, every time a cruise ship is held offshore, our phones keep going off and people want to know what's happening because there is that fear. But there's something very profound about seeing a cruise ship out to sea and seeing people on board those vessels unable to get off. There's something powerful about watching a person on board a cruise ship and communicating by way of digital technologies to their families and their friends that something has happened and they're not sure. And they are kept offshore. The fear begins to perpetuate itself. But once we have protocols in place, methodologies in place that allow us to test, using the science, come to a conclusion, and then implement the outcomes, then we are in a better position. But there's nothing like seeing a cruise passenger with their faces pressed up against the window of their stateroom, unable to disembark that ship. There is a human impact of all of this. When people are able to finally get off that ship, the emotion is something that's also incredibly powerful. And we have to bear in mind that we are cruising, we are flying, and we need to be able to ensure that all across the Caribbean, not only are we treating to the economic impact of making sure that in an environment where we are already vulnerable, already exposed, already with very little buffer, we're already trying to get our economies going again, that we do not allow the economics of fear to cripple us even more so than the actual economic impact has the potential to do as we stand. And so I don't want to go into anything further than that, except to say that for the purpose of our tourism sector, both by way of cruise and air transportation, we have a potential crisis on our hands that can only be managed with information, the science, and containment. And for our cargo sector, we have the potential also, and I think Dr. Ram raised it in our wholesale distribution and retail sectors, for our productive sector, our trade sectors, to be impacted by production limitations, particularly in our major producing countries like China. And we have to be able to bear that in mind, because when food items in particular, basic items to which we are accustomed, are no longer on our shelves, then we are in a position where we have to realize that there is a direct economic impact, even if none of us ever get sick in this room from the virus itself. And with that, I hand back over to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I think the point that you made among many about confidence being the oxygen that drives our economies, and then obviously fear acting as a way of undermining that very confidence required to sustain the best laid plans. Before Senator Cummings went to the podium, we had signaled to Dr. McLeod that her turn is coming up. I see her appearing on the screen. As you should recall, she's the head of the UWI Center for Hotel and Tourism Management. So, and she's located in the Bahamas. If you don't mind me calling you Michelle, welcome. You have the floor.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning, colleagues of the University of the West Indies and the entire Caribbean who may be listening, and those who are tuned in to UWITV at this time. I just want to state, certainly we are going to see the Caribbean region coming together in a global response to what is our current threat. The World Tourism Organization of the United Nations has pointed out that the COVID-19 outbreak as a major and evolving challenge for the tourism sector. And the sector should address this with sound judgment and proportionate measures. It is estimated that the impact in terms of negative growth would be somewhere between 1 to 3% decline in tourism arrivals. And currently, international tourism arrivals stand somewhere between, it's around 1.4 billion persons across the globe. And this is estimated to be a loss of somewhere around US 30 to 50 billion in international tourism receipts. And the United Nations World Tourism Organization also points to the World Health Organization advisory against travel and trade restrictions to countries experiencing an outbreak. And I think as the leading World Tourism Organization, the Caribbean should be following on in terms of the guidance being provided by the UNWTO. Dr. Ram earlier from the Caribbean Development Bank pointed to the importance of tourism for our tourism-dependent economies in this region. And he highlighted already that travel and tourism, GDP, and these figures come from the World Travel and Tourism Council, the WTTC, is 15.5%. And that translates to some US $62.1 billion. And I would just want to add that in terms of our economies, tourism contributes 13.5% of total employment, or 2.4 million jobs in the Caribbean region in 2018. And based on this, we understand the importance of the tourism sector. And certainly when we look in 2018, in terms of arrivals, visitor arrivals from certain selected countries, the majority, some 43% of our visitors come from the United States of America. From Canada, it's 13%, France 6%, Germany 3%, and the rest of the world 35%. So certainly we would anticipate that there would be some impacts as it relates to the number of persons traveling from those countries where there are outbreaks. But friends and everyone listening online, I'm very confident that in fact, as a Caribbean region, we have come together and set up the relevant agencies who are going to be able to guide us to deal with this threat. We have the CARICOM, heads of government, and they have set up the COVID-19 Caribbean Tourism Task Force, bearing in mind that tourism is our mainstay in this region. And we have our own regional institution in 17 countries, the University of the West Indies, who have set up the COVID-19 task force. And I am a member of that task force led by our Professor Clive Landis, based at the Cave Hill campus. And mentioning the COVID-19 Caribbean Tourism Task Force, some of the membership of that task force includes the Caribbean Tourism Organization, the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association. We have our Caribbean Public Health Agency. We also have our Global Tourism Resilience and Crisis Management Center, who are also part of that wide Caribbean Tourism Task Force to respond. And when you look at some of the measures being taken as part of that task force, particularly the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, they have set up webinars and training, and over 400 hotels and tourism destinations have undergone the training as to how to be sensitive and respond to any potential instances where you need to monitor a COVID-19 situation. And so there are resources online at the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association that all our persons in the tourism and hospitality industries in this region can access. There is also a tourism health information system that is a monitoring and confidential reporting system, giving real-time information as to when visitors come to this region. They will go through a particular protocol if there is a potential COVID-19 situation that may come about. And so they would be monitored, that will be reported, and whatever measures need to be put in place to deal with that situation, it can be dealt with. And I must say, I am based here in the Bahamas, and the Bahamas Hotel and Tourism Association, their entire membership, the information has been coming out regularly as to all these resources. What are the protocols if someone checks in at the desk? And even before they check in, upon arrival, the immigration card, there is a form that is completed so that if there needs to be any monitoring, so as soon as the person lands, they are monitored. They're also monitored at the hotel. And so I am very confident that our region has sought the readiness to ensure that our tourism industry would be able to manage this COVID-19 threat that has come upon us. And we had our previous speakers speaking in particular about the cruise industry. And certainly there is concern. Being a member of the COVID-19 task force, I learned that there's a possibility that clusters and an outbreak may occur on a cruise ship. And what I must say is, and you will hear about preparedness in that regard from colleagues speaking afterwards, but certainly the cruise ship industry is a very important one for our region. We have many cruise lines who have come to our region, they have invested in our region, and they have contributed to our economies. What I would want to point out, the two countries that particularly have very large cruise ship visitors, we have, of course, the Bahamas. Despite a major catastrophic hurricane last year of Hurricane Dorian, the Bahamas had record-breaking 7.2 million visitors. And when you look at air arrivals versus sea arrivals, for each air arrival, you have something like 3.4 cruise ship visitors coming in. So the cruise ship industry is very important for the Bahamas. And similarly for Jamaica, in 2019, Jamaica had something like 4.2 million visitors. And when you compare the air versus the cruise arrivals, it's like one for each air visitor, you have 1.7 cruise ship visitors. Certainly, you've heard from the previous speaker, some vessels have been turned away from ports, but they have gone to ports where any situation can be appropriately handled. And definitely, the Caribbean will continue to have cruise ship visitors adequately being monitored and contained to deal with any particular situations. And the cruise ship industry, they have been close in contact with both the heads of government and in the region, and also the Caribbean Tourism Organization in that regard, to ensure that the appropriate protocols and monitoring is being put in place. And from what I have seen, certainly they advise everyone across the globe, if you are ill, you should not travel. And there are ways in which persons can be monitored to ensure that our visitors and our local populations will continue to remain safe and secure to this COVID-19 threat. I just want to mention in terms of the impact on employment in particular, if we're looking at the cruise ship industry, we have a number of small micro enterprises. So you're thinking about our straw market vendors, our tour, taxi operators, also our various attractions that are all part of that cruise ship industry. And we have to be particularly concerned as to what measures can be put in place to ensure that the impact in terms of the employment of these very important contributing operators to our cruise ship tourism industry would not be as great. And in that regard, I see so much opportunity across our Caribbean region for intra-regional travel as well. So in terms of our intra-regional Caribbean airlines, you have Caribbean Airlines, Liat, Bahamas Air, and also Inter-Caribbean Airways. to be able to provide that ways and means in which persons can move across the region and be able to access and support some of our tourism industries, and also opportunities for even intra-regional trade. We heard earlier about what is happening in terms of the possibilities of major trade routes being impacted. So while we prepare and while we put things in place, the various protocols to ensure that we remain safe and secure, I think there are opportunities for regional tourism organizations, the Caribbean Tourism Organization and the Caribbean Hotel and Tourism Association, to look at where we can create opportunities within the region to support our very vital and important tourism industry in the Caribbean. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Welcome your very insightful messages, as well as the reporting as to the level of coordination among regional agencies clustered around the tourism product and the tourism service. I think the information you provided leaves us much relieved at the way in which the interagency coordination has unfolded at this point in relation to tracking visitors, in relation to seeking to ensure there is a common understanding among players as to the protocols that are required. We are going to field some questions at this point, and there are some questions both from the audience and online, and I'm going to have Professor Moore, just read out some of those questions for us.
Well, I'll start with the first one. Can the cruise ships use the science and spend some money on making their ships more healthy?
It's a good question, and it's a question that's occupying the cruise lines themselves. So at this point, currently, the cruise ships are testing passengers on board for influenza A. I believe they're working through now influenza B to get there, and then where the request has been made for there to be greater capacity to test on board the ship for COVID-19. The challenge that you have, obviously, is that the science is still evolving. And so whereas there have historically been rapid tests which are available for quick use on board the cruise ships for other types of viruses, the ability to rapid test for COVID-19 on board the cruise ships is still evolving. And so we are using largely a lot of the laboratory capabilities in country, and that is the reason why we're seeing a lot of the testing taking place in country. But there will be moves as soon as that science is available for the cruise ships, and that has been made as a request already, to have the capability on board to test any passengers that are suspected cases and who have a travel history of interest. And that travel history of interest is defined as someone who has been to an area of interest with local transmission or imported transmission of COVID-19 and who is symptomatic. So that is being worked on.
Continue, Professor Moore.
All right, so should the private sector treat COVID-19 as a workplace health and safety matter and cover the costs associated with workplace protection for employees and customers?
I think we heard a combination of responses to that by Justin Ram, where it was clear that both government and the private sector ought to work. Try again. Okay, now your mic should be about on.
Now, yes, they digitally connected. That's great. Yeah, so I think that the response here has to be a combination. We can't expect the private sector to certainly shoulder all of the responsibility on its own. It has to be, I think, a public-private partnership at this point in time. Remember in my presentation I said that if there's going to be a liquidity crunch and the private sector is to be impacted by that, either through a reduced demand for the goods and services that they provide, or if there is going to be a likely decline in productivity from their employees who can't come out to work, then of course there needs to be some sharing of the burden. I think what's important for us here, and as Senator Cummins said, is that we have to take a longer term view of this. We want to ensure that although there could be, and I say there could be because it's not as yet, there could be a short-term challenge, we have to ensure that in the longer term we can come out of this with perhaps stronger economy. So looking at building resilience, and I think that that can only happen if we were to have the correct partnerships in place between both the private and the public sectors.
Thank you, Justin. Michelle, if you're still there, you will recall there was a question asked about the cruise ships and whether or not they can use the science and spend some of their own money to, make their vessels also ready for medical surveillance and so on.
I am confident that the cruise ship industry, that industry will take all the measures necessary to ensure that the testing that is required and the protocols will be in place. Certainly, if there is a situation, most of our cruise ships return to home ports in the US, and they would be prepared to deal with those situations. But in terms of persons boarding ships, before they come to the Caribbean region, protocols would be put in place to ensure that persons who are boarding those ships would not meet or have any eventuality of having a possible outbreak. Of course, from what I understand from my science colleagues, there are certain periods of time to have this particular virus. So if it's a shorter cruise versus a longer cruise, and the industry will need to respond appropriately with that regard. So whatever investment is needed, as I said, they are at the table in terms of the Caribbean, the COVID-19 Caribbean Tourism Task Force. They are at the table. That task force, they are members of both the CTO and the CHTA. So the coordination is going to happen to ensure that our cruise ship visitors and our local population will be safe and secure in terms of having this industry continue and be ready to be continued during this COVID-19 threat.
To come back in to say what is actually happening on the ground as we speak. So in the last few weeks, we have put a number, there are of course already protocols in place governing what happens on board the cruise ships. But we've been spending a lot of time in our national and our regional conversations on testing, whether or not the cruise ships are going to be testing and so on. But before we get to the stage of testing, there is a rigorous pre-screening process that takes place before a passenger is even allowed to embark on the cruise ships. And so if you engage directly with the lines, they will tell you that there are passengers, based on their recent travel history, based on the fact that they are perhaps symptomatic or they may have a temperature test, because that is one of the measures that they're using now on board the cruise ship, temperature testing. Then in some instances, passengers are denied embarkation onto the cruise ship in the first place. While that passenger is on the ship, and we could have, especially here in the Caribbean, a 5-day, 7-day, 9-day cruise on average. Those are the types that are, or 14 days cruises. There is the Maritime Health Declaration that is provided to the medical officers prior to that ship arriving in port. And there are 3 maritime declarations which are required, maritime health declarations, before that ship arrives in a country. And the medical officials are looking to see how those declarations evolve from the first one up to the final one, which is required between 4 to 6 hours prior to arrival in country. If there is a deterioration in number of persons who are unwell on board the vessel, then there is a particular threshold that is required, and if that is not met, then you have a certain protocol that kicks in, and that, I would want to assure people, is being followed aggressively by our medical officials, by our port health officials who are in port throughout the day and even in the night, through the weekend, and they're reviewing in collaboration with our respective ministries of health what the actions need to be to ensure containment.
I have another question from online. How do governments prevent hoarding and price gouging of healthcare products that authorities have recommended to be used to prevent the spread of the coronavirus?
That's a particular concern, and I think we all know that in any circumstance, hoarding is actually not a very good action to be taking. And so really what has to happen now is that there needs to be education of the population around as Senator Cummins said, around where we are currently with respect to this. It is not a crisis as yet for us in the Caribbean, and we need to take a measured approach to it. I think it is also important for us to understand that there are likely to be impacts on supply chains. So if you, for example, an individual is trying to hoard, then it means that you're actually having a knock-on effect, what we call in economics, a negative externality impact on others in society, because if you're hoarding a lot of products and others don't have access to that, and in fact that can exacerbate the situation if others are unable to protect themselves as well. So I think we need to have a measured approach, and I think here it is a responsibility perhaps not only of the government but also of all public agencies, including the University of the West Indies, to educate the populations in our countries to let them know that hoarding is not a correct form of action at this point in time. We have to have a communal approach to this and ensure that we're all protected rather than only protecting a minority, and therefore, in effect, you are then leaving many people out there exposed. So I think it's really critical that we adhere to those best principles at this point in time.
Okay, I recognize a question coming from our live audience present. Yes, we will request that you go to the mic.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. So my question or my response is in relation to the hoarding of materials being used by those infected and also by public health professionals. As a public health professional, of course, this is a public health crisis, and the entity that speaks to the management of crises like this would really be government. Perhaps government should consider legislation that prevents hoarding and also protects the availability of this material for those people at highest risk. Some countries are already having that conversation. What Barbados may end up realizing is that the public health crisis defense is weakened because there isn't the availability of essential products. Thank you.
Yes, very good point. I was reliably informed today that some officials at the port, I will not call, some of the persons at the personnel only had one glove wearing, where there should be two, but a further check revealed that there was a question of not being able to access these supplies. So the hoarding could be real and it should be stopped.
All right, I have another question online. This one is for Dr. Ram. Given the need for broader fiscal stimulus from the state and set within the context of the current challenges for development and the clear impact of globalization, what are the key lessons that we are currently learning for perhaps diversification of Caribbean economies and perhaps greater economic systems for self-reliance? Are there any lessons going forward? Is this something we can or should explore?
Sure. That's a really, really good question, and I think one that we're always grappling with here in the Caribbean, that whenever there's a crisis, we realize the limitations of our current economic model. So yes, of course, diversification will be critical. And this really reflects on the need for us to build resilience. As you know, as a region, we speak mainly about resilience building as it relates to natural events. But here, I think this crisis also reminds us that we need to build resilience in our health systems. But what does that mean? If we translate that, what does that mean effectively? It means that it's important that our governments are in a position whereby they can respond to such events. And this is why I've said earlier that we need to have fiscal buffers. So when, as economists, we speak about the need for governments to run their fiscal houses in such a state that it's in a sustainable manner, it means that they can then save and have fiscal buffers to deal with things like this, rather than having to go to the markets and borrow every time. We also speak about the need for us to have competitive economies. And why is that so important? It's important that governments don't have to be the only agencies or perhaps authorities that are providing the necessary services. There are many things that governments are doing now that perhaps the private sector can be doing. And if there's a competitive economy, then the private sector would find that they have the wherewithal to do those types of things. And I should just say one final thing here. When we speak about having a competitive economy, it is, of course, in that context where we're trying to build resilience, but it also means that it helps build the resilience of the individual if the individual has access to equal opportunities. I think that that's really critical for us. Governments they have to ensure that individuals in society have access to equal opportunities. And once you have access to those equal opportunities, you can then translate those equal opportunities into tangible rewards if there is a competitive economy. And all of this helps build a resilient economy and eventually building resilient households and individuals as well.
Okay, I'm going to add to that. I see Lisa just signaled me that she also wants to follow that thread in light of the very good question posed, because there are a variety of ways in which we could respond to that particular question. It's interesting the terms used by Justin, a competitive economy and so on, and fiscal buffers. From my standpoint, I would say my position complements what he's saying, except I would argue that a more diverse economy is a more robust economy, and a more robust economy affords the opportunity for the state to provide that protective response in relation to crises of these kinds. The protective response will take the form of being able to have that fiscal policy space to do a few things, as Justin is suggesting. But fundamentally, if you are an economy driven by a particular model that depends on the discretionary spend of North Americans and Europeans, and if that particular development model is not being augmented by an industrial policy that says we need to diversify away and around that, then you will find yourself perpetually stuck with such a model, with the limitations that would pose. So I think what has happened and what has been trending is a tendency to shore up what we have by way of paying attention necessarily to our public financials without treating to the developmental that needs to be done as well. And I think this lesson here for us is that as we pursue policies that lead to financial sector openness and so on, we still should allow governments the policy space to frame an industrial policy that could get us to a position where we're more robust, diversified, and in that sense you will have a competitive economy that can respond.
Thank you, Don. I agree wholeheartedly with both Justin and Don. I think those are extremely important questions, important answers to a great question. Now, I only want to weigh in on two elements of this. One, we have a tourism-dependent model for the purpose of employment and for FX, and obviously we've seen how that has worked. I want to make 2 points. From within the Barbados port specifically, we have spent a lot of time, certainly in the last 20 months, looking at the data, assessing the data, and we've just completed a quite sizable study, body of work, which looks specifically at the cruise industry. Now, when people talk about a cruise vessel dealing with COVID-19, for instance, and being turned away from one port, we're very sensitive here to the fact that no cruise ship leaves Miami or Fort Lauderdale and comes to a single itinerary. This is an entire Caribbean itinerary, and so multiple economies are impacted with a single vessel having been turned around or not coming to the Caribbean. So my notion here is that we have to be talking about diversification away from exclusive dependence on the tourism sector, as both Justin and Don have said, into other sectors buffeted by a strong industrial policy, but we also have to diversify within the tourism sector. And I say that because in our study that we've looked at, 10 years ago in 2010, the Caribbean was the #1 destination in the world for cruise tourism. There were 5, at the time, regional options outside of the Caribbean where cruise ships were going. As at 2018, among 15 destinations in the world, so the cruise sector itself has diversified. They're going to other countries and other regions, and you have a larger number of persons who are traveling on cruise ships. But even so, the Caribbean still remains the #1 choice among cruise passengers in the world. So what does that mean? It means that we have to be looking at the demand and diversifying to create new demand, creating new products and services that are vertically and horizontally integrated within the tourism sector, but also buffeting that by economic development in new sectors, industrial development and so on, buffeted by that fiscal policy intervention that Don talked about. So we have to be able to be conscious of that as well, even as we talk about the tourism sector.
And it has stimulated, this question stimulated to a response that Michelle wants to offer. So, Michelle, you're online.
Look at the Caribbean tourism industry. In terms of air versus sea arrivals, about of the 60 million visitors that come to our Caribbean region, about half of them are in fact cruise ship visitors. So the cruise industry is a very important industry for our region, and we have to ensure that when we look at the Caribbean tourism industry, we look at how best we can integrate and involve the cruise industry as part of that discussion. While land-based tourism, we can look at diversifying and look at growing our land-based tourism activities in terms of the nature of tourism, whether they come by air or sea. That sea component will continue to be very important and continue to be a dominant factor in terms of how the Caribbean grow its tourism industry in the future. So while we think about diversification, certainly in terms of the land-based tourism element, but within the future, that sea element would also continue to be very important, and we should look at how we can grow that element as its contribution to our region. Many Caribbean destinations, they have invested in ports. We have here in the Bahamas, one particular cruise line, they have a major multi-million investment in an island. So we have to be mindful of the contribution, I think, being the nature of tourism and how it evolves. That sea element will continue to be dominant, and it will continue to be very important in the future.
Thank you very much, Michelle. It's at this point where we are reaching the conclusion of this segment of the Vice Chancellor's Forum COVID-19 Partnering in the Caribbean's Response. I'm going to allow you, Michelle and Justin, to have a final word. What I want to suggest before we all, as a panel, turn over to Professor Moore, is that a number of interesting points were raised today, both in the addresses and in the Q&A. And one of the things is quite clear to me, because I'm kind of an optimist, and I would like to say I think what's quite clear is that this region has an opportunity to showcase best practice. As it stands right now around the world, there isn't any real steady, there's no settlement or consensus around the best approach to handling the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen China, based on its own determination, doing things in relation to quarantining an entire province and so on in order to contain the spread. We've seen in the United States, different states are coming up with different responses. The governor of California declaring a state of emergency and so on, yet it's not a pandemic. And we see here in the Caribbean that we're coming closer to some kinds of understandings and common understandings, and the opportunity is there for us to craft a coherent response, and noting the points that Senator Cummings made about the variable capacities across the island nations. And I'm sure Justin would agree that if you note the variable capacities, then the costing of the kinds of adjustments, the costing of the protocols themselves would not be the same. Some governments may have to take on a greater intervention, play a greater interventionist role than others. Some have more robust public health systems than others, and so on. But clearly, we are seeing the early signs of coherence and consensus around how we approach this. And those will be my final remarks. The next voices you will hear in this order would be Dr. Ram, then Dr. McLeod, and then Professor Moore. I want to say apologies on behalf of Senator Cummings, who had to leave urgently for another meeting, but I know she enjoyed this forum very much. That's me, Don Marshall. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Don. I just want to leave with a few final comments. I think once again, with this type of potential crisis that we have on our hands, it reminds us that we have short-term interventions that we need to take. We have to steady the ship, as it were. And that will require a public-private partnership response. There are certain things that the government will have to do in terms of regulations and as one audience member said, even perhaps thinking about passing new legislation. I hope it doesn't come to that. But then the private sector also has to play a significant role here, because they would have to be in a situation to support maybe work from home. If employees need to work from home and have to self-quarantine, then you want to ensure that they can still be paid and can still be productive as possible. So what I really want to say in the short term is that the demand side impact, and we have to be ready and willing to respond to that. And then finally, I just want to say again, this reminds us of the importance of building resilience. So important for us here in the Caribbean that if we think about everything that we do in terms of our daily lives, in terms of policy, how is that going to impact on resilience building? So that it's not a matter of whether these crises will happen, it is when they do happen that we are in a much better position, as Don said, that we need to have the industrial policies in place so that we can have more competitive economies. But then I also want to reemphasize that we live in the 21st century now, and digital is critical. If we don't have the correct digital connectivities and the correct digital infrastructure in place, we are going to be left behind. And this shows quite clearly why it's important for us to have these things in place. And it's not only about medical digital, it's also about being able to do transactions digitally as well, so that as far as possible, when these types of events happen, we can still have our economies operating and churning, and therefore we won't have the negative impacts on GDP as could be likely in events like this. Thank you.
You weren't supposed to hear me again, but Michelle, are you there? If you're not there, I will move to, yes, she's there.
Me? Yes, Caribbean community and friends abroad. Certainly, we are one Caribbean, and it is my view that as the Caribbean, we have come together and we have brought all our critical resources on board to ensure that we put all the mechanisms in place, all the protocols in place to deal with this. I am confident that our Caribbean tourism industry going forward is going to be able to continue its very strong performance. As it was already mentioned, we have beautiful isles in this archipelago, and so our resources here will continue to be an attractor for persons coming to this region, and this region has put in place what is necessary through both the various task force to ensure that the COVID-19 threat that currently faces us will be managed and handled appropriately.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. McLeod. So I have with me now joining us for this second seminar, or this second panel for the Vice Chancellor's Forum, two very eminent scholars who will help us on this issue of preparedness. I encourage our online viewers to continue posing your questions. Those questions that we didn't get to in the first round, we're going to have those posed to our panel in this second round. And I'll just like to introduce these members of this second panel of the Vice Chancellor's Forum. First, we have Pro-Vice Chancellor of the Board for Undergraduate Studies, Professor Clive Landis, who's to my immediate left. He's a professor of cardiovascular research and former director of the George Allen Chronic Disease Research Center. He led the inflammation and wound healing program in the GACDRC. He's the honorary director of the Ministry of Health HIV Laboratory, past chairman of the National HIV/AIDS Commission Subcommittee on Research in Barbados, chairman of the Caribbean Cytometry Analytical Society, and past associate editor of the Journal of Clinical Cytometry. And he is the current chair of the regional task force on Zika as well as on COVID-19. So he's eminently qualified to speak on this topic today. The second individual on the panel to his left is Mr. Ronald Jackson. Mr. Ronald Jackson is the executive director of the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. Mr. Jackson was formerly the director general of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Emergency Management in Jamaica, and has extensive experience in the area of disaster management at the national, regional, as well as the international level. At the national level, he's lent his expertise on the coordination of the national response to the impact of Hurricanes Charlie, Ivan, Dennis, Emily, and a number of various natural disasters we've had in the Caribbean. He's also been instrumental behind developing guidelines for child-friendly disaster management and response. So in terms of the order of presentation, Professor Landis will first make his presentation, then Mr. Jackson would present, and after that we'll have another round of question and answers.
Good morning, everyone in the room and those watching online. I'm waiting for my talk to be queued. So it doesn't seem that long ago that I would have been standing at a similar forum for the Zika task force, which I chaired. And I think to set the context of the COVID-19 task force, I want to remind us that in the past 11 years, this is now the fourth viral outbreak that we're facing as a region. And I would remind you that we got through the others, and I think we will get through this one too. So, This isn't the flicker. Where is the control? It looks like someone's taken my slide. Oh, here it is. Yeah, I think. Yes, okay, I have it. This is the COVID-19 task force. It was set up a week ago. And you can see that some of the members of the task force haven't even sent in their photographs yet. It's all so fresh. But one of the task force members, Don Marshall, you would have heard this morning, so he needs no introduction, and nor would Michelle McLeod. So what we did to set up this task force is that we used the same collaborative model that we used for the Zika task force. And that is a model whereby the university makes its expertise, its wide expertise available to the good of the Caribbean, and we work very closely with the local ministries of health and local disaster preparedness agencies, such as we have with Ronald Jackson on the panel today. So it's a very collaborative model, and in the Zika task force, we were able to, at the invitation of governments, to assist in certain areas. So, an example. In Jamaica, the National Influenza Laboratory, which is in the UWI Mona campus, made its very considerable molecular testing capacity available for the Jamaican government, and it did all the tests for Zika. And then the reporting of the Zika cases would go through the government to CARFA. So that's UWI helping to make its expertise available to our national government. And that's the way that we will work for the COVID-19 task force as well. So what we have on this task force is very wide expertise in virology, epidemiology, laboratory diagnostics, critical care medicine, veterinary medicine, tourism, trade, development, international relations, and communication. And the remit of the UWI COVID-19 task force is really twofold. It is to coordinate the UWI's own internal readiness. We have a very large community of students and staff, around 60,000 across the Caribbean, and it is to help inform the Caribbean's response to this epidemic. And I would agree with Michelle's assessment that I'm really seeing a lot of solidarity coming from the Caribbean. When I look at some of the other countries and somewhat fractured responses, the Caribbean, I believe, is coming with a very solid response. And I do note from my field in laboratory medicine that every epidemic we have, our preparedness gets better. And I'm actually quite proud of the state of preparedness of our laboratories at the present time. Now, it may seem strange to start with a summary, but I want to get everyone in the same headspace where I believe we should be for looking at COVID-19. And I will read the quote that came from a very authoritative report of the WHO China Joint Mission on coronavirus disease, where a panel of 25 experts from the WHO went out to China and did a very detailed analysis of the first 57,000 cases of COVID and really learned a tremendous amount. And this is what they said. COVID-19 is not SARS and it is not influenza. It is a virus with its own characteristics. So, although COVID-19 virus belongs to the same coronavirus family as SARS, it actually is more contagious in a way that influenza would be. So it's contagious, but actually it has a different way of being transmitted, some different ways of being transmitted from influenza, and transmission chains can be interrupted. That's been demonstrated in China very clearly. So COVID-19 is thought, based on really available data in China, to have a higher case fatality rate than influenza. And this is observed mostly in high-risk groups, the elderly and persons with chronic diseases and other medical conditions. So this is the space which I want us to think about as we go through. The COVID-19 virus belongs to the coronavirus family, and this is a large family of viruses that affect animals and humans. So COVID-19 is what we would call a zoonotic disease, and that means it has jumped from an animal to human. It is different from Zika, where we're looking at a disease that is vectored, and it is really linked to the environment and mosquito breeding and things like that. COVID-19 has jumped from an animal, which is as yet unknown, to humans, and now it is being spread by human-to-human transmission. So this has happened before, twice in recent times. The SARS epidemic, which again came from a market in southern China, and in that case the jump was from a civet, which is a wild creature that looks a little bit like a mongoose, and it spread from that into humans. And MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which came from dromedary camels in the Middle East. The mode of transmission has been investigated very carefully by the WHO team that went into China, and I'm going to read a quote from them. And please listen and understand this very well. Airborne spread has not been reported for COVID-19. Okay? So I'll read that again. Airborne spread has not been reported for COVID-19. So airborne spread is, you breathe the air that I breathe and you catch something. That is not the case for COVID-19. COVID-19 is spread by droplets, and this is sometimes called aerosol transmission. So droplets are produced when someone sneezes or coughs, and the droplets are little blobs of liquid which are heavier than air, and they will land on a surface and contaminate it. And coronaviruses can remain viable for several days on contaminated surfaces. And generally speaking, in humid climates, they will actually survive a little bit longer because it helps the droplet survive rather than in very dry climates where they would survive for less long. And so spread via droplet is predominantly thought to be indirect, which is via the hand-to-mouth route. Now, people might say, what is all this about hand washing? And, it doesn't seem very sort of technical to be talking about washing hands, but every person touches their face dozens of times an hour. Some people will touch their face 4 or 5 times a minute and not know it. But you just touch your face, Justin. And so the hand-to-mouth route is very well known and understood by epidemiologists. And so that is where you touch a contaminated surface, and then you touch your face, your nose, your mouth, your eyes, and you will then catch the contaminant. And of course, a commonly used surface is going to be more likely to have to be contaminated. So, for example, the doorknob to a bathroom would be a very classic case. And the second route, which is direct, which is if someone sort of coughs or sneezes directly into your face, well then the droplets will contaminate you. And so that's the latest advice from the Keep Calm group. But more seriously, this is the World Health Organization advice to protect yourself and others from becoming sick. And it is very good advice to wash your hands after coughing and sneezing, when caring for sick persons, before, during, and after you prepare food, before eating, after using the toilet, when hands are visibly dirty, and after handling animals or farm waste. Now, here is another very important piece of research that came out of China, and this could help inform the Caribbean response. So, in China, human-to-human transmission of the COVID-19 virus is largely occurring in families. That is a quote from the report. So in provinces outside the epicenter of Wuhan, which is Hubei province, the analysis revealed that between 78 and 85% of clusters in Guangdong and Sichuan province, these are huge provinces, over 100 million people, 78 to 85% of clusters have occurred in families. And so family clusters actually offer an opportunity to trace contacts, to isolate clusters, and to interrupt transmission. And also, from a treatment and compassion point of view, it provides an opportunity to extend care and medical observation to families who might be in self-isolation. So bear in mind this thought, that transmission is mostly in clusters, because this does offer an opportunity for interdiction. Clusters have, of course, also been detected in other closed settings, so long-term care facilities. You will see the data that this affects the elderly in particular. Prisons, cruise ships. I'm not suggesting that cruise ships are like prisons. They're just because they were juxtaposed like that. But cruise ships, we've shown that where you have testing capacity, you can manage a situation on a cruise ship very well. So I will never forget in 2009 when the so-called swine flu, the H1N1 influenza outbreak happened. A cruise ship came to Barbados and it was refused entry and was turned away because someone had sneezed on the cruise ship. And we couldn't test for it. And so look at what happened Friday a week ago, where again, same situation. A cruise ship came to Barbados, someone sneezed on the cruise ship, a suspected case, and within 4 hours, our laboratory at the Barbados National Medical Reference Laboratory had tested it. I mean, this is the way in which you build confidence and you remove that panic. And the situation was dealt with, and the cruise continued, and this is a strength that we have at the moment. Our laboratory testing is actually quite good across this region. And we have the reference lab at CARFA is testing for OACS countries. Some of the OACS countries have their own accredited tests. Of course, we have it in Barbados. We have it in Jamaica, the Bahamas, Belize. The laboratory testing capacity is good, and this is going to be a strength that we should leverage. I will also continue that clusters have been detected among healthcare workers. So there was one cluster that was clearly outbreak related, and it was at a time when they did not have sufficient protective gear and they're really overwhelmed. Generally speaking, healthcare workers have learned how to handle the infection possibilities due to SARS and other similar diseases. And when they looked at healthcare workers who were infected in China, the majority were infected actually at home. Remember family clusters? So they had someone in their family who had COVID-19 and they caught it. So healthcare workers, they must be properly equipped, and then they can handle the risk that they're exposed to quite well. Children. Well, this one has come as a surprise. Remember when we said that this is not influenza, it's not SARS? Symptoms appear to be mild in children. To date, there have been no deaths due to COVID-19 in children aged between 0 and 9. I can see from the looks in the audience that, this may be a surprise to you, and other coronaviruses do have similar profiles, but really something as clear as this is unusual. And so, to date, no deaths recorded in children 0 to 9. The role of children in the transmission of the virus remains unknown. So who is at risk? So these are crude case fatality rates according to age and sex in China. This would be laboratory confirmed cases. Now, I want you to understand this very clearly. These crude fatality rates are going to be an overestimate. We know that because they're in laboratory confirmed cases. What about all the other cases? People who are at home, self-isolated, never tested. So these are going to be an overestimate. But nonetheless, it gives you a very clear idea of where the risk lies. So you can see, as I had mentioned, no cases in the 0 to 9. I'm going to go from the bottom up in that panel A. 10 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, all very low risk, 0.2% case fatality rate. So that's 2 persons out of every 1,000 who would die. And then it starts creeping up, but really it starts picking off around 60 to 69 with a crude case fatality rate. My eyes are straining here a bit. I think around 4%, then it's around 8% in the 70 to 79, then it jumps very significantly in the over 80s to 15%. So it's the elderly who are at risk of this disease. And there's an overrepresentation in males compared to females. And the reasons for this are not really known. It could be something specific to China. Males have a much higher smoking rate in China, or it could be something that's going to be replicated in other parts of the world. And again, who is at risk? So persons who have pre-existing medical conditions and chronic diseases are at elevated risk. So for anyone who has cardiovascular disease, the crude case fatality rate in China was 13.2%. So cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, chronic respiratory disease, and cancer. These are, having these conditions puts you at risk for a fatal infection with COVID-19. What are the symptoms? Symptoms are quite different from influenza. So fever, yes, that will be similar to influenza. But then dry cough, okay? Not a wet cough, not sort of the, ruddy nose, eyes, aching joints and things like that. Aching joints do come later, but it's definitely distinct. So fever, dry cough, shortness of breath. If you have these are indicative of a COVID-19 infection. Fatigue is another major symptom. Sputum production, that's what comes up from your lungs. The green stuff, joint pains, sore throat and headache. But going from the top, fever, dry cough, fatigue, sputum, shortness of breath. These would be things to look out for. Now, symptoms appear on average 5 to 6 days after exposure, but the range, so that's from the most extreme that's been recorded, is between 1 day and 14 days. The disease severity, 80% of cases are mild to moderate. Generally speaking, these would not involve hospitalization. They can involve hospitalization if you have uncomplicated pneumonia, but these are classified as mild to moderate. 14% of cases are severe. This would normally involve intensive care treatment, critical care, and 6% of cases are critical, which would be multi-organ failure, and half of those, in fact, will be fatal. So the majority of cases are mild to moderate. The median recovery time for anyone with mild to moderate disease is 2 weeks. Now, let's just think about this. As an institution, we are mostly dealing with students who would be below the age of 39. So anywhere below 39, they all have the same risk, relatively minimal risk. And because the case fatality rate is very low, it shows that most have mild to moderate disease. So even if students are ill or staff are ill and they have to go home, generally speaking, we'll see them back in 2 weeks. And then recovery time for persons with severe or critical disease is between 3 to 6 weeks. Now, here is an important point for us to consider, and this is where I think we can position the Caribbean to make use of whatever advantages we have to try and tackle this epidemic. So it is a myth to say that there is no treatment for COVID-19. It's true, there is no vaccine, but there is treatment. So consider this. The Crude case fatality rate in Wuhan, that was at the beginning of the outbreak, for Wuhan was 5.8%, other parts of China 0.7%. So the epicenter had 5.8%, all other parts of China 0.7%. But the fatality rate in Wuhan dropped from 21% in the early stages of the disease to 0.7. So now they've rejoined the rest of China. So what's that telling you? It's really telling you that when they were completely overstretched and simply couldn't hospitalize people and take care of them, then they had a higher fatality rate. In Germany, there's now been 957 cases in Germany, no deaths. Now, Germany has the highest proportion of critical care beds per population head in Europe. So this is telling you that there is treatment. It is supportive treatment, but there is treatment, and it's very critical that we understand that. So this kind of information suggests that mortality is higher when healthcare systems are either under-resourced or overstretched. So earlier identification of cases and contacts is therefore essential to allow earlier treatment. And this is a very important slide. So we know that intensive care capacity in the Caribbean is not like Germany. It is relatively limited. However, our laboratory capacity is actually better than we've had for any previous viral outbreak affecting the region. So we have the tool, the critical tool, to mount a prevention, containment, isolation, and treatment strategy. So prevention will require a lot of good communication, public education programs. Everyone is doing that. But we have the opportunity to mount an effective containment and isolation and treatment strategy because we can leverage the available laboratory testing for earlier identification. Just the other day in Trinidad, there was 3 suspected cases. In fact, in Barbados, there was 4. And they all came back negative. When you have this ability to quickly exclude, and at some point, someone's going to come back positive, but if you do it quickly, you can then isolate the person, you can take care of their family because of this idea of transmission in clusters. And so we have the opportunity to limit the spread of the virus, use our laboratory testing capacity to have early identification and isolation and treatment of cases, to delay and flatten the epidemic curve. You know, some people say, well, delay, you know, it sounds a little bit feeble. What's the point of delay? It's going to happen anyway. Well, there is a point, because if our intensive care capacity is relatively limited, and you can delay the cases. If they come to you in a more measured way instead of all at once, then we will cope much better. And so I believe that our strategy in the Caribbean should be prevention, containment, isolation, and treatment. That should be our strategy. I'm going to talk about UWI Ready. This is now, I'm really talking about our internal community. A task force has a responsibility to assist Caribbean communities and help wherever we can with Caribbean governments and disaster agencies, health agencies, but we have a responsibility to our own community. So the current advice from the WHO, the CDC, the European CDC, and CDM, it recommends a phased response for workplace readiness. And the reason that phased response is useful is that it gives you an idea that you have a mobile epidemic. So you have to, there are different phases to it. The response to different phases will differ. And in different countries where our universities positioned, you might have one country that's at a different stage than another country. So you have the preparedness stage, and this is before you have any cases detected in country. And all of this is in the UWI's COVID-19 management plan. And so an institution like ours, but it holds true for any institution, can undertake things on their own initiative before cases are detected in a country. So preparedness, setting up hand-washing protocols. I mean, I had to laugh when I heard of the shortage of these hand sanitizers. I mean, are any of the students from chemistry? Do I have any chemistry students here? What's in a hand sanitizer? It's just 60% alcohol, some diluent and some polyethylene glycol to give it a little gel-like thing. I mean, we should be making this. We should be making this in buckets, and there's no intellectual property concerns here. There's nothing proprietary here. So these are things that you can do in the preparedness stage, and I've put that in green. The containment phase, so these are steps that an institution must take together with the national health ministries, and this is when you have sporadic cases. So you can't act on your own, you must do so with the health ministries and health agencies. And then you have the transmission phase. This is when transmission in the community has been declared in the country. This is a point that is reached, and you make this declaration because it helps you understand where you are. And then you would take steps as an institution in conjunction, again, with the national health ministries and within the regional disaster and emergency management framework. And so you'd be working with ministries of health, maybe ministries of security, and you will be taking advice from them. And the UWI's management plan is designed to provide guidance to the leadership of the UWI, and of course we have, as our regional university, campuses in sovereign countries, and so the campuses will have to take a significant lead in this. So the UWI's management plan is intended to be operationalized in conjunction with campus COVID-19 management teams, the emergency operational plans that campuses already have to deal with hurricanes and things like that. They may need to be adapted. A health literacy campaign targeted at staff and students. This has to be non-stop. It has to be relentless. You communicate openly and clearly all the time, explaining what you're doing, explaining what phase we're in, and what people can do to keep themselves safe, and what we're doing together with the governments to help extend care to anyone who falls ill. And then guidance is, of course, provided by the national ministries, because our campuses operate in sovereign countries, and the disaster and emergency management agencies. And so we have guiding principles. So it is that we make these assessments to keep up with the dynamic nature of this epidemic. And we will always use best available scientific advice and evidence to inform our decision making. And we must maintain trust and confidence among our campus administration. And I believe that's slightly incorrectly written. Trust and confidence in the campus administration from our community, UE community, but also the wider community. And to minimize the potential health impact by slowing the spread, which I've already spoken about this containment, isolation, and treatment strategy. And we would always ensure dignified treatment of all affected. And of course, we are a global player, and the way that we have operated the Zika task force, the way that we're going to operate the COVID-19 task force, is to be a regional and a global player, working with all the designated agencies and our member countries. And so this is my last slide. So a lot of the heavy lifting is going to be done at the level of the campus. So some of the campuses have already established COVID-19 management teams, others are being established, and they will have expertise to guide all the phases of the response, the preparedness, containment, and transmission phases. And so you will see how the planning and preparedness, which takes place on your own before there's any transmission, that's in the first phase. Communication, as I said, is throughout all phases. Continuity of teaching and learning, this is like sort of pushing on an open door as far as I'm concerned, because in my capacity as Pro Vice Chancellor for undergraduate studies, we're encouraging distance learning anyway. And, you know, this will provide a spur to put more of our content into blended and distance learning. This is exactly what we want to do. And this would be taking place through all the phases. And the containment and treatment phase, when sporadic cases start happening, we have to make sure that we are all together as one body on our campuses. And this is true for our communities as well. We cannot turn on each other if someone is ill. There has to be a very clear, non-stigmatizing approach to when someone is ill, so that we can encourage people to come forward. And if we can see people as soon as they show symptoms and isolate them, and using our labs to test them, either to exclude them or to confirm them, we can contain this outbreak. And then finally, you reach the phase when there is widespread community transmission, where business continuity becomes a very key thing. And that would be my segue into Ronald's talk on from SEDEMA, because a lot of our guidance would come from SEDEMA for this, in fact, almost all of it. And so I think I will end there, and I will just like to use the phrase that has become the unofficial motto of the UE COVID-19 Task Force, and that is, together we will get through this. Thank you.
So while I wait for my presentation to come up, I just want to express our thanks to the Vice Chancellor and the UE family for organizing this event and for including us. We at SEDEMA really look to the University of the West Indies to bring thought leadership to a number of the issues we are all grappling with. Yes, we are experts in the field, but we do believe that the university community should bring their brain trust to help government with dealing with these issues. And so very pleased with this activity. So let me step back a little bit before I get there. We're dealing with something new, and I think Prof. Landis really illuminated a number of our minds with what I consider to be facts. And that's important for us to really look at the facts and how facts will drive or preparedness. So I will start by giving some key messages, what I call some good news and some bad news. The good news is that there are existing processes and mechanisms that were established not only by CDEMA but by a number of emergency management agencies which are now maturing. And you would have heard from the speaker in the Bahamas around these tourism groups, these sector-specific groups that are trying to work together within the sector to help the sector understand, manage, prepare, build capacity for dealing with these issues, but also investment in plans, existing plans. Whilst this is a new virus that we're dealing with, the response can be planned, the preparedness and response can be planned on the basis of the national pandemic plans that have been invested in and developed both by national governments and also with the support from PAHO, CAFA, CDEMA, and a number of others. That's the good news. Another good news, which we often, and I hope I don't take any hits for this, but which we don't often always see as consistently, is evidence of political leadership in terms of how it is coming to and treating with this particular issue, which I think is good news. We need strong, decisive political leadership around how we tackle, plan, and prepare for these, and it's showing up in a number of the countries across the region. Improve efforts at better coordination and an effort to address the challenge within the context of the resilience building context. So we heard Justin in his presentation talking about building resilience. And I think it is quite apt that we're looking at this issue within the frame of resilience building. And I will touch a little bit on that in my next comments. However, we have some bad news which we have to be mindful of and to try to stay away from or to address. One of those bad news is the new culture of preparedness and prevention is not yet fully embraced. We're still on that pathway. So yes, we're seeing positive signatures, but we're not yet at that space, and we can use these experiences over time to continue that transition as a population. Our emergency services, notwithstanding the improvements in the lab, and you'd have heard this also referenced by Prof. Landis in his comment, our emergency services are already resource constraints. So if we're looking at this issue, we have to recognize that we're starting from that point and trying to address what is a new issue. And the third bad news, fear is negatively impacting the effective and smart preparedness. And this is why it was so important, Prof. Landis, your presentation of the figures, because if many of us consume our news from CNN and from other sources, we're going to be paralyzed by the very negative pictures being shared and the limited detailed information that is being shared on the cases that allows you to better plan and prepare, especially in our resource constraint environment. So for us, it's important to identify our current capacity and design a strategy to work within the predictable constraints and activate an external support mechanism where possible. So before I go into my slide on screen, you would have heard reference to the term, the resilience context. And CDEMA promotes partnering with a number of our institutions, CDB being one of them, the Caribbean Resilience Pathway. And it touches on 5 very critical pillars: social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable. And I'm raising these because as we talk about dealing with this particular issue, a number of these pillars become very, very important. In fact, all of them, if you were to look at the Singapore example, all of them are coming into play. Social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable. The cases we're seeing, people in homes, people who are on social support mechanisms would need to be considered, particularly if you go into social distancing scenarios. How are you going to deal with the needs of these particular individuals? Enhancing economic opportunities, and Justin did a fantastic job, I think, of walking us through where we are, what is likely to occur, and the implications, and certainly one of the questions asked about diversifying our economies away from tourism, given the implications that this may have on our product. Safeguarding infrastructure. So we're talking about here the health sector, critical infrastructure, and its current capacities and how we can ensure that we can strengthen these infrastructure to be able to deal with challenges of this nature. And of course, in the Singapore case, they also focus on the environmental protection component in their wider plan. And the fifth pillar looks at operational readiness and recovery. So we're talking about readiness, preparedness for dealing with this particular issue. And so why it is that I say it's very important, the good news, we're focusing this issue within the framework of resilience. So what's been happening? So SEDIMA, while we look at this as an initial health crisis situation, we have to recognize that any health crisis can morph beyond simply a health response. And you would have heard the statement, a whole of government approach. So very early, 6 to 7 weeks prior to today, we have been working with our national emergency management agencies across our 18 participating states to get them to dust off these pandemic plans and to begin to look at the dimensions for planning, using this as the platform, but also to engage with their health sector personnel. And we've been doing this direct with the national emergency management agencies, but also jointly with CARFA and the various CMOs, where we've been having weekly meetings to really get a sense of understanding what it is we're doing and what are the sort of strategic and operational plans that we need to put in place and identify some of the priorities that will go along with that. So it's happening nationally and it's happening regionally over the period. We've looked also at the whole issue of scenario planning. We pride ourselves on operating on an evidence and fact-based approach. And so, we've been trying to get member states to really look at the facts and figures, both in terms of what is happening externally that we're able to learn from, but also looking internally at where we are in terms of an understanding of our own population. So you'd have heard the details provided in terms of where you see the cases occurring. What sector of your population is over 80? Where are they? The whole issue in terms of knowing the particular NCDs and other cases that are there. Do we know them, and how this can help us understand the capacity of our existing health sector to deal with what could be potential cases that we could be dealing with. So we've been trying to encourage member states along that line, and also we have taken steps ourselves at a regional level, working with partners to look at this whole issue of scenario planning. We've developed a continuity planning guideline and also a supply chain guideline, and have been sharing this with member states and also regional partners to help plan going forward. And we have, as I said before, ongoing collaboration with CARFA, PAHO, and the National Emergency Management Agencies. Interestingly enough, in December, during our comprehensive conference on disaster management, we came to an agreement with CARFA and PAHO, particularly for the Caribbean regional exercise which SEDIMA puts on, called Synergy, and it's a partner exercise between ourselves, Impacts, RSS, and CARFA, which we do every year now going forward. And we decided that we wanted to look at the whole issue of pandemics. This was prior to, to anything happening coming out of the Wuhan case. And we had scheduled that exercise for May 2020. And I think given it's interesting, in my former professional life, every time we would plan a hurricane or a tropical storm exercise, we would have an event. So I'm wondering if we're falling into that trap again by planning the exercise in this. We have to be careful. But in engagement with our regional partners, wider than simply those involved in the planning of Synergy, it was felt that we should take every step to bring this forward as a means of ensuring that the regional architecture could exercise around these particular plans and begin to look at the specific challenges, given that this was something we were dealing with for the first time. So we're working at bringing that forward. And of course, we've done an initial briefing of the donor community to begin to sensitize them to what it is that we're doing. Now, typically our triggers relate to a member state being threatened or impacted. At the moment, CARFA indicated they were moving the threat level for the region from low to moderate to high. We saw that as a trigger for the regional coordination plan, because what they were saying to us is that it was imminent. And so we had to begin to accelerate our own processes for preparing for this particular scenario, and hence we went into a sort of briefing and discussion with CARICOM agencies who would have a specific role to play in this exercise, both in terms of directly responding, but looking at things like the education sector, the labor arrangements, etc., across the region. And so we had a brief meeting, well, an extensive meeting actually. We thought it would have been brief, but there were so many key questions they raised that caused us to elongate that meeting on Thursday, the 5th of March, and then on Wednesday, and then on Friday we briefed the donor community. So, as we speak, we must note that the prevailing condition that the region is in terms of its current operational readiness and response context, the challenges that we're facing in terms of resource availability, which may impact on approaches to preparedness, and you heard this coming out in both the first two presentations on the economy, Justin and the Senator, which talks about the supply chain and how that could impact on accessing critical resources for responding. We already know that things like personal protective equipment is at an all-time low in many of these states, and it's not a cheap product. It's very expensive. And, we're told that it's I think, 4 per patient for, I'm trying to remember if it is 24 hours or 48 hours that is required. I just say that to say that if we're in a state of responding to this situation, we're going to have to look at how we're going to deal with preparing ourselves with the type of equipment that will help us to respond. And if you have a supply chain that is already being disrupted, then it really calls on us to look at how we're going to cope in that context. In terms of some of the next steps we're looking at, we are looking at ongoing process for gathering readiness information from the member states. So ourselves and CAFA, we've put out to all the member states a short survey for them to respond to. CAFA on the health sector side in terms of where they are in their health capacity, and on the CDMA side looking at the issues around what would be your quarantine center, what approach would you be taking to deal with social distancing and humanitarian support if that occurs, and whether or not you would really have the capacity based on the scenario information that you have. Looking at what sort of external arrangements can be made to move people safely and with the type of protection into the space to be able to respond and support. We're continuing the scenario planning exercises over this week, working with the member states on a day-by-day basis. We have a team internally that is, we've divided the region into 4 sub-regions, and we have one person working with the group of countries in that particular space to ensure that we can help them with that particular exercise and to garner as much information as we can, and why the presentation by Prof. Landis was so important. In fact, I'm going to request a copy of that because there are questions you were asking that pertain to some of the information that you've shared there. We're working to finalize the regional protocol, which goes beyond simply looking at cruise ship, but looking at how we will deal with our very open borders, ports, airports, but also the open borders in terms of surveillance. And so we're working with impacts who are putting in their bit into that particular framework to look at that. We'll be working with people like CDB and others on the broader economic aspects of it. So it's a very comprehensive framework that is touching on even crisis communication. And then, of course, finalizing our continuity guidelines, supply chain guidelines, and to provide our continued guidance to the National Disaster Committee. And in that regard, National Disaster Coordinator, in that regard, we've developed a checklist, which we're circulating to them and working with them again over the phone to make sure they're completing this to inform the sort of regional support mechanism and identifying gaps that we can also put to the wider community of donors, maybe even the CDB, around how we can resource some of those gaps that are there. And where necessary, we will move to activate the RCC. Now, this you won't see so clearly, unfortunately. It was not really designed for a PowerPoint presentation, but essentially what we did here in terms of our regional scenarios, we were playing with different scenarios and how we would then see sort of a staged approach to planning and dealing with these issues, going from stage one, I should say, where we're looking at the continuity of governance and encouraging the activation of governance, continuity of governance and business plans. And you heard Justin in his presentation talk about working from home. So the telecommunicating policies and strategies on how we're going to put those in place to ensure that we keep our economies going, but also keep the critical responders in place to be able to deal with the issues. We've looked at the issue around the health sector component, which is in the first stage, but then how that also ramps up in the box below, which you can't see, into health EOC activation, but also a wider coordination platform being activated to provide support on policy, to look at port operations, to look at coordinating resources, to support those that are quarantined or socially distanced, and look at the overall resource mobilization and planning to support that particular activation, and managing the direct impact where life-saving becomes critical, and containing confirmed cases and preventing further human spread into stage 3, which is where when the state-level capacities are overwhelmed, then the regional mechanism is activated to see how it can support with resources, with people, and particularly based on the geographic locations, etc. I just pulled this out. This is my last slide, which is some extracts from the current pandemic, regional pandemic plan. You'll find similar language in national plans, just less reference to terms like the regional response mechanism, other than it is triggering the mechanism. And I just share this because, again, I wanted to assure you that we do have a platform on which to plan. And if we can begin to use this and to infuse the knowledge that is coming out, both from the WHO mission to China, new knowledge that is coming out in terms of how the virus is behaving in the different spaces across the region, the advice that we're getting from those who are in research and epidemiology, then I think we can use this as the basis for planning or operation and having some level of success. And I too agree that we see the region really coalescing around this particular issue and trying to ensure that it is framing a comprehensive approach and plan, national to regional, and working within that space of solidarity. And for us at SEDIMA, this is certainly pleasing. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you.
So I think we had some really excellent presentations this morning. This last session was essentially looking at the whole issue of preparedness. And a lot of really useful information was brought to the fore this morning when we had these presentations. So now is your opportunity to interact and ask any questions. I have one question from the audience already, and there are a number of questions online as well. So please.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes, just want to set a little bit of context, especially given the discussion that we were having this morning, and I heard our colleague from SEDIMA bring up the potential for disruption in the education sector, particularly from the youth development program's perspective. Our question would really be in terms of trying to plan to ensure that we can have an effective response to the continuity of the education sector, particularly as it relates to the persons outside of the University of the West Indies, which has more of an infrastructure to respond to the challenges in that sector by having our blended learning or online portal possibilities. When it comes to secondary schools and other tertiary institutions in the region, particularly in primary school even, where we have responses where there have been tele schooling and so on being done overseas. As we get later and later into the stages of this potential outbreak, what plans do we have in place, and what plans can we have in place to ensure that there is a continuity in the education system, particularly from the exercise of things like the Caribbean Examination Council's examinations, which are almost all written on paper? How can we actually respond to that particular situation and ensure that we are able to continue supplying the labour market with the needs in this particular environment? Thank you.
I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I think it's an excellent question. And I think, if we can find positives out of these types of negative consequences, I think the event itself is driving us towards building on, as I said before, existing approaches that we have been working with but not applying within the context of these particular situations. And why we had this regional conversation with regional institutions that had a role to play, both in terms of directly supporting the response, but also looking at how it then deals with some of these broader sectoral issues. And CXC was one of the key participants where we raised this issue around how their continuity of operations would need to unfold, and particularly given that we were coming up to a period of examinations. Now, I do know that CXC has a platform to be able to do that. Whether they are now in a position to be able to switch to that, it's something that they have to now internalize, and why the briefing was so important for them to now begin to think about that and have advanced time to plan to see if that could be put in place in the event something like that occurs. Again, many of these schools, even at the primary level, for some of them, definitely at the secondary level, they have websites, they have platforms that they're building and evolving. Again, out of that can come the sort of virtual space where they can continue learning or teaching the students who, if they go into a social distancing context, are our resources and material in a position to be able to react to that. I don't know that we're there yet, but I think out of this can come the sort of plan that we will. This is not the first, nor will it, I think it will be the last pandemic threat we will see. We've seen, and Prof showed us a timeline of some we've seen in terms of the threat of SARS, MERS, even with the Zika and CHIKV where persons were having to be home. How were we facilitating those particular needs? So I think this is giving us an opportunity to come out on a positive side in terms of our plans. That's what I can offer as it relates to the education sector at this time.
I know, for example, from the perspective of the Cayfield campus, this is something that we've already started to discuss already. The university has been using blended learning for a number of years now, where you sort of supplement the online learning with face-to-face instruction as well. So isn't the case that you are always going to have face-to-face instruction all of the time? And similarly with the examination as well, you can utilize a number of online tools. So Dr. Ram mentioned this morning the whole idea of going online and being digital. That is something that we can utilize for testing as well. It is an issue that we have discussed, and we haven't really come to a conclusion as yet. But as Professor Landis also mentioned as well, the science on this issue is not as scary as you might see on television. So unless someone comes and sneezes directly in your face, you're unlikely to catch the coronavirus as well. And that's something we might need to take into consideration when we're thinking about the examination period as well. I have a couple of questions online as well. Some of the questions have potentially been answered by the great presentations we have this morning, but I'll still put them out there. The first one that I'll open with is, most Caribbean islands are tourist destinations. How can we still keep our doors open for tourism while still protecting the population?
Prof, point to me. That's a very tough question. I think even listening to some of the earlier presentations, there's so much that I think we're going to be challenged with, because if you're already seeing slowdown in travel in the airline industry, you're seeing what's happening with cruise. So the question is, what is going to be the consistency of the throughput over the next few months? And so what will you have to be able to manage as an industry, and what strategies we have to put in place? And one of the reasons why I started my presentation around coaching the conversation around resilience, because there could be significant impact. And when we're looking at even the sort of gender differential, when we look in the tourism sector, you have more women working in the sector than men, and we can go through in terms of the age cohorts and income levels. But what strategies would we be putting in place to deal with that particular shock? We could say we could encourage more regional tourism in the space where we're losing some of the visitors from our traditional sources. But we also have a challenge there in terms of the barriers to regional level tourism, which I think may have been touched on by Justin. I don't know. So it's a difficult question, but I think one that the cohorts of tourism actors under the tourism sector committees that supports the CDM strategy could take on to begin to look at these things. And why, again, I see this as an opportunity for us to look beyond the traditional risk and threats at future and emerging risk and threats to see how that will impact on how we've traditionally come to operate. Yeah?
I have another question online. Hopefully this one is a lot easier because it's right up your alley. How is the COVID-19 response to families and communities in the Caribbean similar to the hurricane response, where many NGOs and civil society organizations and just regular people form part of the response? And what have our institutions done to be inclusive in this regard?
So, again, in the absence of dealing with any situation such as this, yes, your traditional approaches to dealing with a hurricane could be applied with some modifications. Fortunately, we have pandemic plans, and the pandemic plans do draw on the existing national architecture. So when we talk about social distancing, the welfare, the humanitarian needs of individuals who have been quarantined or socially distanced can become something that is going to need to be treated with. And here is where your community mechanisms and your Red Cross committees can support. Now here, we have to be a little bit careful because now you're dealing with a virus that can be spread, as you would have heard, through aerosol. So what sort of protective resources do these community emergency management groups or Red Cross groups have in place to be able to provide that type of support? So the mechanisms can be applied, and this is something that we've said we're using existing mechanisms to assist. The challenge is the current resource constraints that these systems face. In an ideal world, you'd be able to equip your community response teams and your various sector response teams to be able to deal with this particular challenge with their kits, but we are not there yet. And why we now need to begin to get to this culture of safety and resilience building.
Dr. McLeod is online, and she wants to add to this discussion as well.
Me? Good. Yes, thank you. I think it's very important to note, and as was already mentioned by the gentleman from Sedema, in terms of informing the response, information and needs to get out there, and I'm very thankful for the Vice Chancellor's forum for helping in that process as to what this virus is all about. I think there is still a lot of persons who are not aware of what is happening. And so what we have seen from the international agencies and the international community, and I mentioned it earlier, particularly advice coming out from the World Health Organization. And I would note again, they indicated that their advisory points, the UNWTO points to the WHO's advisory against travel or trade restrictions to countries experiencing an outbreak. I think it's very important as a region, we continue to understand what is happening in the international community. We take the measures, we continue to be informed, and not respond in a manner that will prevent persons from coming to our Caribbean islands. And so with this dissemination and ongoing process of informing the communities throughout the region, I think we will be able to manage better this entire threat that we have of COVID-19.
Very much. Prof. Landis, you want to come in as well?
Yes, I'd like to add to that. The UWI's COVID-19 task force, we view our number one priority to put accurate and reliable information into the public space so that people can understand what's happening to the region and what this this epidemic is about. So the first Vice-Chancellor's Forum, which was entitled Demystifying the Coronavirus, that actually was the most watched output that we've ever had on UWITV. And people would be looking at the recording, so we had significant viewership on the live stream, but then the recording is available. And so you can tell that there's an appetite for persons to have access to accurate information. And the university is consciously positioning itself as the place where you have well-researched, accurate information put into the public domain through UWITV in particular, but also other avenues. So we do invite members of the public, whether here or in the Caribbean, to look for our outputs, because we have put together a task force that covers all of the areas of expertise that would be required to have an informed response. And we view that as the number one priority of the task force.
Okay, so we have two questions from the audience now. Dr. Marshall?
Thank you for this opportunity again. As a member of that task force, thank you, Chair, Professor Cleveland, is asking me to sit on it. But as a member of the task force too, I'm very conscious that one of the things the universities the world over are responsible for is to promote norms and useful values. So as a normal entrepreneur, so to speak, I was particularly intrigued, and I shared with Justin your reference to the idea of dignified quarantining. And I think I think we need to think through that, particularly University of the West, is we need to think through that and help and participate in advising what dignified quarantining would be, because we don't have psychologists in the room, but if you're going to have people quarantine around the region, then certain kinds of standards and ethics have to be in place. It's not some place that's like a detention center for them to want to seek to escape. And we don't want trauma to follow the event. So there are certain things that we would have to be very careful about in terms of thinking through what Caribbean-style dignified quarantining would mean. Again, it goes back to points earlier made about the regions seeking and aspiring to lay best case examples and best standards, and not waiting for what other standards are there globally accredited and known to draw down from. We could actually set the global standard. Yeah.
Just a quick comment on that, because in 2015 we had this reframing of the humanitarian architecture, and one of the it's called the Agenda for Humanity, and one of the very important aspect of it was this whole issue around dignity. And even in terms of how we are managing traditional responses, and you know, there's a need for us to look at this issue around dignity and understand what it means within our context and how we will plan for that. So it's certainly something that within SEDIMA and working with member states, we're looking at a number of those issues in terms of safeguards and other aspects. It's an emerging space, and certainly something we welcome the UA's support in looking at how do we do this. You know, we've been working for a long time with places like the School of Planning and Building. I can't remember what the new name is. I went there when it was cast, and it was just simply architecture. Now it has, in looking at designing transitional shelter solutions, you know, to really address this issue around the dignity of people who are displaced. And I think, you know, those are the kinds of things we need to do more of, but also engage and encourage our centers of higher learning to help us think through how we can do that within the resource environment we live in.
So I've been standing up here trying not to touch my face. There's another question from the audience.
Both sections. And one question I have would be that how to phrase this. Now, as a non-national student and being from the Caribbean, I know that with the coronavirus, there will have certain constraints that will affect the economies, which would lead to, unfortunately, a level of inflation with the potential of travel. Now, for me to get home, it takes 2 to 3 days flying. With that said, can a discussion on a government level be done for a level of protocol when it comes to us as students? Because in a couple months, you will see that due to the drop in Caribbean travel, it will cause prices more likely to go up, making it much more difficult for UWI students to get home. So would that discussion could be formed on a government level, which would allow us, well, demystify the stigmas, because right now they make it seem that if you get it, it's likely that you're going to die within 2 or 3 weeks. So could that, I mean, from the way how it is portrayed in the media without the proper information being given, could that happen on a government level so that we could have a more easement when traveling?
Okay, I won't answer the travel question, which I think Justin. Yeah.
It's more about the fact that.
Okay, but I will answer the other side of your question. So, when it comes to non-nationals and how they're treated, again, we need to go back to the dignity of the person and the solidarity that the Caribbean has shown up to now. It's very important that we continue that, and it's going to be relatively tricky if a non-national, let's say, who is on halls, a student who is on halls, becomes ill. We have to work with the Ministry of Health and decide, what is the most appropriate way to care for that person. Note that I said care, because, based on everything that we understand, with good care, the person will be fine. We don't need to just push them away and hide them. We need to care for the person. But it's not going to be, a trivial issue. Because national protocols, may suggest that, well, the safest place to put persons in Harrison Point. But even if they are in Harrison Point in a designated quarantine facility, we still have to, as a university, care for that person and make sure that we extend all due care. These are not necessarily going to be easy issues, but as long as we keep discussing with our governments, with our agencies, and keeping, as Dr. Jackson said, the dignity of the person at the center, then I'm confident that we can overcome these issues.
I have a follow-up question to that, because that was also a question that was posed online as well. So I'll just pose it so that it falls on quite nicely from that. What happens if a member, if a member from one state becomes ill in another state? Would the regional response be to treat the person as if they were in their own country without prejudice?
So there are certain norms in the medical community and ethical standards that mean you treat everyone. And so, this is not the first time we've had a viral epidemic affecting the Caribbean, and the HIV response and the way that we handle persons who have HIV is, I think, very instructive of how you do so, in a very sort of non-stigmatizing way. And it's good for the public health and the stability of the country and the region to do so. So I don't think that's a question of, are we going to treat people? Of course we will. That is medically ethical and required. Now, what arrangements would be done at the government level to, I guess, financially sort of work out the resources? That's probably above my pay grade. Maybe that's more your pay grade, Dr. Jackson.
Well, I think generally the principles on which the regional mechanism is built looks at when we move to that level on the basis of solidarity, there are some regionally shared costs. We can go into a conversation around whether the resources that are set aside to support that is robust enough. But there are mechanisms that looks at how do we deal with a regional scenario and how we finance that.
Just one more question from online. Prof. Landis, I know you've spoken about this in your presentation where you indicated that the regional testing capacity is significantly better than a couple years ago. But the question online is, how do we ensure that all regional territories can conduct testing and large-scale testing in the event of a serious outbreak?
That's not a very easy question to answer. When you're dealing with a new illness like this, you depend on quite sophisticated tests, which are known as molecular diagnostic tests. So no one in our population would have antibodies against this virus. It's new. Usually when we speak about rapid tests, something that a doctor can do, a little sort of dipstick kind of thing, it's where you're measuring the body's response to something. But those haven't even been developed yet. So we're looking for the actual virus itself and its genetic components, and we detect them. And that particular level of diagnostic test is still not available at point of care in very sort of simple doctor's offices. I think it will be in due course, but not as yet. It is still a fairly sort of heavy-duty test. I can easily see the ships which carry 3,000-4,000, the cruise ships which carry 3,000 or 4,000 passengers, to have a laboratory that could run those tests. I'm sure they will have them before you can blink, because I think it's so important to be able to confirm or exclude if someone has an illness. So I think that's going to happen without a doubt. And I do look to technology to make these point-of-care tests available. There is one on the market for HIV, which is a rapid test of this nature. But then, of course, we already knew about HIV for many years, and so we know how to modify the test to make it smaller. In due course, I think that will happen, but for now, there would always be the referral mechanism, which is from some of the smaller countries, which would refer to CARPHA, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and they've tested dozens of cases from across the region, and that's still fairly quick. It's not the situation that we had for chikungunya and Zika, where a lot of the islands were referring via, they were referring to the CDC in Atlanta. And, with all the best will in the world, those results wouldn't generally come back within a week or so. And by then, you really, the person would already have, maybe finished their entire disease course by then. It's not really informing treatment, it's not really informing quarantine. You must have a quicker response than that. So the referral mechanism to the reference lab in CARPHA in Trinidad from the smaller islands, that's working well.
One more question.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the panelists for your presentation. This might have been, forgive the location, better placed in the prior panel, but just with the link made between the hurricane response, for instance, and our response to disasters more generally, and the kind of whole of states with regards to the constraints Caribbean governments face. I know a lot of our countries are in the throes of IMF programs and structural adjustment programs, Barbados being no exception. I know in particular with regards to Jamaica, there are kind of escape clauses for in the case of a natural disaster, specifically hurricanes, to sort of allow for higher levels of public spending and give that fiscal response that Dr. Ram talked about. So I was wondering, are there any specific provisions? Can it be folded under the broader natural disaster type clause, or are there any specific provisions for a public health emergency for countries facing or within IMF programs to be allowed to respond to that? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's a Justin question, but but before Justin answers, though, I think this from my lens, this really speaks to a broader question of government's declaration of the particular event. Right? Because there are generally clauses associated with national declaration of an emergency or a disaster that then triggers some of these conditionalities. In the specific case, I can't say, but I can speak to the general term and rubric of a national disaster or national emergency, which this could become if it exceeded the national capacity to deal with the particular challenges. So I leave Justin to talk about the IMF and the economic side of things.
That was a very good question. And in fact, yes, so for many of the countries that are currently going through the homegrown adjustment programs that are supported by the international financial community, there are these natural disaster moratorium clauses with respect to debt. So if there's a disaster and you have to deal with that, then you get some time to not pay the interest or the capital, but you do eventually have to pay that towards the end. You do get a net present value benefit of that because you're now paying those monies later on. Those clauses don't necessarily include this type of crisis, but I should say that within the international community, there's flexibility. We're not going to say to you that you must stay on this course when obviously you can't do it at this point in time. We can, of course, try to adjust the targets, perhaps saying, okay, the debt target that you were supposed to meet, let's say in 2030, now you have to meet that perhaps in 2035, just gives you a bit more time. So the flexibility is there. I mean, I think everyone who works in the international financial community, we also have a duty of care, and we have to look at this from a humanitarian perspective as well, so that during the discussions, for example, any country that is going through an adjustment program now, in their next engagement with the international financial community, there will be discussions around the flexibility to see how this can be dealt with, if there needs to be fiscal space where there currently isn't any at this point in time.
Thanks a lot, Justin. One more question from online. How important is it to develop specific communication and response plans for vulnerable communities, such as the disabled and elderly, for preventing and testing of COVID-19?
No, I can't overstate the importance of that. You know, when the whole basis of vulnerability is the backbone of how we plan to deal with any hazard or threat. We have to identify those who are likely to be most vulnerable, and we have to address not just the planning, but also the type of communications that are going to be necessary for these individuals. And so I think this is very, very, very important and cannot be overstated. Yeah? Oh, sorry.
Yes. Well, this is at the heart of how this epidemic is affecting communities. And as you saw from the data, it is the elderly and those who are carrying previous conditions who are disproportionately affected. And the next important discussion that I would like to see held, which I really haven't heard as yet, is how we're going to look after, particularly our elderly. This is really the heart of the discussion. As a university, maybe instinctively we focus on our student community. We want to keep them safe. But we know that the major risk is actually to the elderly. And I think that's going to need to be the next.
All right. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this Vice Chancellor's Forum on COVID-19, partnering in the Caribbean's response. In the first session, we investigated the potential economic impact of COVID-19 for the Caribbean. In terms of building an economic response, it was suggested that forbearance for borrowers moving towards the digital economy is key. Building fiscal buffers, it would also be a very useful response. In this last session, the speakers also recommended that prevention, early identification, treatment, and containment is the best plan of action for the region. It's also important that we communicate clearly to the public regarding the stage we're in and what this implies for you as an individual, business, and country. So colleagues, I am Professor Winston Moore, and I would just like to thank you for viewing this Vice Chancellor's Forum on UWITV. Thank you.